Judge our partisan thoughts and convict us to attend to the common good. We have taken our obligations freely, but we remain beholden to your guidance. Hold us then accountable to your powerful word. In the strength of your holy name we pray. Amen.
That's the new House chaplain giving the prayer this morning, especially significant, of course, Rhonda. So, Rhonda, I did want to get this contradiction from you of the call for unity from Republicans, and yet these incredibly serious charges and accusations we're hearing from law enforcement.
That's right. That's something we've been hearing from some Republicans. And I should say that, yes, we have had Liz Cheney and other House GOP members who have said that they are going to vote for impeachment. But you still have a large group of the Republican caucus who they're messaging this idea of we just need to be unified right now. We need to move on. We need to heal. But they aren't saying very specific things that need to happen in order to get to that healing. But it is different. It is different from what we've heard from them before, and at least it steps toward talking about working with other people across the aisle. That's something that we have really not experienced, honestly, in the last few years. You know, you've had a lot of hardcore Republican members say things against the Democratic members that we have not heard before, and vice versa, but you've had a lot of President Trump's allies on the Hill really putting forth this message of that their side is right and the Democrats are trying to obstruct everything. Right now you're seeing some Republicans, even if they aren't coming as far as Liz Cheney, they are kind of dialing back and at least saying, okay, this is a moment for unity. And I'm interested to see if any of those who have been saying things like that, I've heard Jim Jordan, who of course has been a supporter, an ally of the president. He has had a little bit more of a measured tone than I've seen him before yesterday in the Rules Committee meeting. I'm just interested to watch today play out and see if that messaging that we've been hearing from Republicans shifts in any way where it's more explicit, saying that the president was wrong and we're calling him out now.
Just to update our viewers, the House has recessed for 15 minutes, so we'll go back to the floor when they come back in. You know, James, so much to talk about. I do want to pause for one moment and reflect on the fact that we just saw a woman chaplain open the prayer here on the House floor. This is Rear Admiral Margaret Grin-Kibben, and she was recently appointed by Speaker Pelosi to become the first woman to serve as chaplain there. You know, obviously, she was trying to choose her words and figure out how she could begin this important day with reflection as well as sort of a call to action.
Yeah, and you heard her there, Libby, describe it as a mobocracy that descended on the Capitol, a strong word in a prayer setting. But a lot of times, you know, those chaplains who are picked by the leaders are you know, can have their messages are very on the news. And very responsive to what's happening, not just in the chamber, but in the world. And, you know, this is something that I think that's a reflection of how much this has shaken Washington. And the city is on edge, not just the Capitol complex. You know, members of the National Guard were sleeping on marble floors overnight because they've surged so many in. They're going to have 15,000 members of the National Guard around the Capitol for the inauguration next week. But you know, they're putting up metal fencing all around the city, even outside the Naval Observatory where Mike Pence lives, which they normally wouldn't do during an inauguration. And it just kind of captures the tension that this is happening. And that's one of the reasons that this process is moving so quickly. And obviously, the other factor is that the inauguration is 1 week from today.
So, you know, Rhonda was talking about unity. Republicans, though, in some ways are using unity as a weapon, right? They're calling for unity now, which is supposed to make Democrats stand down and Joe Biden say, forget impeachment, let's not be divisive, let's just move forward. I'm going to be there in the Oval Office in a little over a week. Let's just go on with things, right? And so that's why it's outraging some Democrats, because they want to have a reckoning first before you can move on to the healing.
Yeah, you need repentance before you can get forgiveness in the Christian tradition, and you know, I think it's very hard for a member of Congress like Jim Jordan to credibly say, "Let's move on," when he won't even acknowledge, which he wouldn't during the Rules Committee hearing yesterday, that Biden won the election. He acknowledged Biden will become president a week from now, but he wouldn't acknowledge that Biden won the election. He was appearing at Stop the Steal rallies. And what's notable is that a majority of members of the House Republican Conference voted to reject the Electoral College votes from Arizona and Pennsylvania right after the mob breached the Capitol. So, you know, if they wanted to show seriousness about healing, they might have joined, you know, a bunch of their Senate colleagues who had planned to object, but then rethought those objections after the mob. So it's notable, though, that is the talking point Republicans have settled on. And folks we're talking to say, you know, they really haven't gotten anything better than that from the White House or from leadership, which is not, you know, twisting arms and whipping them as they normally would on a vote this high profile.
Rhonda, you were covering yesterday that hearing that we've been talking about where Congressman Jordan was speaking, and I'd like you to talk through some of the procedures that were happening, but also describe for us that tension that was occurring between Democrats and Republicans.
So the Rules Committee met for pretty much all day, all afternoon yesterday, and that's the step before we see a floor vote. That's the committee that has to prep the rules, as they are called, the rules for debate and also bringing measures to the floor. So it's that last stop before legislation is scheduled to be on the floor. So they had to do that in order to get us to today. And what was in front of them was the 25th Amendment call for Pence to use his powers. They wrote up a resolution to get him to do that. That was yesterday. Of course, he said that he would not use that power, and they decided to vote anyway on that resolution, even though he had already said he would not use that power. But that was mostly symbolic. But they also put forth in this Rules Committee meeting the article of impeachment that they will be voting on today. And it was a meeting full of these tensions that we've been talking about. We cannot underestimate what last Wednesday did to all of us as Americans, and those on the Hill have been left incredibly shaken. I have talked to lawmakers, and people are still dealing with this. And I think this Rules Committee clip that I want to play here shows that there was a lot of tension in that meeting. And this particular clip follows a moment when Ed Perlmutter, a Democrat from Colorado, he was asking Jim Jordan, Republican from Ohio and a staunch advocate of the president, asked him to admit that Biden and Harris won. And as James said, Jim Jordan kind of danced around that question. He said, yes, they will be inaugurated, but I still feel there needs to be some sort of investigation. And that kind of took Representative Perlmutter a little bit to the edge. So I want to play this exchange. Let's take a look.
We had damage, injury to this nation, the likes of which we haven't seen for centuries. And I just want the people to know from somebody who's in a leadership position, as you are, that Joe Biden won the election, Kamala Harris won the election, they're president-elect, vice president-elect, and they will be inaugurated into the position of president and vice president on January 20th.
You know who said
Yes.
that? You know who said
Okay.
that? The President of the United States has said that.
Okay.
It's going to happen.
Then
There's going to be a peaceful transfer of power. But you guys,
that's all.
you guys
That's
don't
all I
focus on
want.
uniting this
Look,
country. You want to impeach the president. You want to look at the 25th Amendment.
So you see there, Jim Jordan is still adhering to the idea that there needs to be an investigation, and that the Democrats were trying to use the impeachment against Trump unlawfully, and all these claims that he made yesterday. However, I will remark that he did seem more measured than I remember him from the last impeachment proceedings, which I think shows that Republicans know they're in a tough spot right now, and it's really, you know, two ways. You either support President Trump after Wednesday's events, or you vote to impeach him. That meeting also had other times of tense moments and emotion. Norma Torres, who is a representative, Democratic representative, she began crying during the meeting because she said she was calling her children when she learned that the Capitol had been breached, and she told them, I'm all right, but I'm running for my life. And it was a very emotional part of that meeting, and just shows you that even as they're working on the business of the day, working on these impeachment article resolution, they still are feeling intense emotion.
Eugene, Scott, one avenue that Democrats were looking at was trying to press the Vice President, Mike Pence, to invoke the 25th Amendment, for which he would need support of the cabinet. So we went through that process last night. At the same time, we saw the vice president put out a statement saying that is not going to happen. So let's talk about the relationship between Vice President Pence and President Trump at this moment, and also just what the vice president has experienced over the past week.
Yes, the past week has been quite a shocking one for those who've been watching the relationship between President Trump and Mike Pence since prior to Trump even naming him his vice presidential candidate. In the days leading up to the Congress decision to certify the election, Trump seemed to turn his attention, even blame, towards Mike Pence, telling many of his supporters that Mike Pence had the power to stop the certification, which he did not. And when Mike Pence did not do what it was that Trump was hoping he could do or perhaps would do, the president blamed him. And so we saw among the rioters a lot of the anger, even directed towards Mike Pence, who by all accounts has been a Republican, at least at the national level, longer than Donald Trump has. There were some of those rioters trying to enter the Capitol, or who did enter the building, who said they were coming for Mike Pence. And so some of the arguments that we have heard that happen on phone conversations between the president and Mike Pence included language that I can't even repeat on this broadcast, directed from the president towards his number two individual. And so what you have seen recently is a reminder that many of these individuals aren't really Republicans as much as they are supporters of the president. Now, perhaps Mike Pence's decision not to invoke the 25th Amendment was an effort to endear himself with these individuals who are no longer looking at him as favorably as they did maybe, a month ago. But it's been set in stone at this point that when these people were hoping Mike Pence would step up to prevent the election results from being certified, he did not. And that will be a huge part of his legacy with these individuals who continue to support the president.
James Hohmann, let's go to you for what you'll be watching today.
It will be interesting to see kind of how this comes across on television. Does this appear to be sort of a partisan thing? Does it appear to be self-interested, or does it, leave people with the impression that the president really is this clear and present danger? Do we hear emotional stories like the one we heard from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, from other members who are going to speak during the debate on the floor? How many more Republican defections are we going to get? 6 members on the Republican side last night introduced a censure resolution to criticize Trump. I think you could get a lot of Republicans to vote for that, but maybe not vote for impeachment. Are some of those members going to get on board? And then what do you see from the party leaders? Obviously, there's tension between Liz Cheney and Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise, the number 2. But do you see people attacking Liz Cheney when they're defending the president on the floor on the right? That could end up adding a lot of combustibility to this very tense situation.
I mean, James, Liz Cheney was being attacked by the president, just, right on the eve of this horrific attack on the Capitol. He was attacking her with words. So, when you start to ask yourself, well, Liz Cheney has been speaking out against the president for quite a while now. She's had concerns about his coronavirus response, about his use of military force and the management of the military. But he was directly going after her. So if you're wondering why Liz Cheney might have taken last night as a chance to speak out, that can help answer some of those questions.
Yeah, no question. And in fact, our colleague Michael Kranish reports that the origin of this decision to vote for impeachment came from Dick Cheney, the former vice president, calling his daughter in the Capitol last week. He was watching Trump's speech in the Ellipse on television, and Trump started to say, we need to get rid of people like the Liz Cheneys of the world. The former vice president, very concerned, called his daughter, expressed worry about her safety, and then noted that the mob was heading toward the Capitol. Dick Cheney also organized an op-ed. He was the ringleader of an op-ed for the Washington Post, not last weekend, not this past weekend, but the weekend before, with all 10 living former secretaries of defense, including 2 who served Donald Trump, basically criticizing the president for trying to overturn the election results. So there's no doubt what Liz Cheney did took political courage. Wyoming is a state that Trump won with 70% of the vote. But it also, this is something where they're offering a very alternative vision of what the Republican Party could be in a post-Trump era.
Thanks so much, James. Eugene Scott, let's go to you for what you're going to be watching today. It's so helpful for me to hear about, James listening for and watching for sort of how this all comes across and how the debate is framed, and, how this conversation is characterized. So what are you going to be listening for?
So one thing I'm really interested in is the putting into context of why so many lawmakers believe that President Trump is unfit for the office. I interviewed Representative Al Green, who you may remember as the first member of Congress to call for the impeachment, or should I say file articles of impeachment against the president. And that was back in July 2019. And so what you're seeing today is people voting for or moving towards impeachment, supporting impeachment, should I say, of the president who hadn't before. But you're also seeing people who have believed, at least for more than a year that the president was unfit. And I believe that some of these individuals will try to support their case and their argument against leaving Trump in place based on last week, with many of the reasons that they have previously believed that Trump was unfit for office, with the hope that that could further persuade some Republicans who were maybe not in Congress during the last impeachment, or who perhaps weren't sure that President Trump wasn't unfit for office a year ago, but maybe now may understand why so many of their fellow members of Congress believe he has to go.
Thank you so much, Eugene Scott, Rhonda Colvin, and James Hohmann. Let's go to the floor of the House of Representatives right now, where they're reading this article of impeachment. We're going to bring this to you live all day.
The 117th Congress. Section 4. Section 5 of House Resolution 8, agreed to January 4th, 2021, is amended by striking January 28th, each place that it appears, and inserting February 11th.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 hour.
Mr. Speaker, for the purposes of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purposes of debate only. I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, today the Rules Committee, yesterday the Rules Committee met and reported a closed rule, House Resolution 41, providing for consideration of H.Res. 24, impeaching Donald John Trump, President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. The rule provides 2 hours of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The rule also provides that upon adoption of H.Res. 24, H.Res. 40 is hereby adopted. Finally, the rule extends recess instructions, suspension authority, and same-day authority through February 11th, 2021. Mr. Speaker, we are debating this historic measure at an actual crime scene, and we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the President of the United States. On Wednesday, January 6th, Congress gathered here to fulfill our constitutional duty, tallying the Electoral College victory of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris after a free and fair election. This is largely a ceremonial role for the Congress, one that sends a message to the world that democracy in the United States persists. But at a rally just 1.5 miles down Pennsylvania Avenue, Donald Trump and his allies were stoking the anger of a violent mob. A member of this very body proclaimed on that stage, "Today is the day American patriots start taking down names and kicking ass." Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, called for trial by combat. Then Donald Trump told the crowd, "We're going to have to fight much harder. You will never take back our country with weakness." Even though, according to his own administration, that this election was the most secure in our history, Donald Trump repeated his big lie, that this election was an egregious assault on democracy. Vice President Pence, he said, was going to have to come through for us. Trump then told this mob to walk down to the Capitol. The signal was unmistakable. These thugs should stage a coup so Donald Trump can hang on to power. The people's will be damned. This beacon of democracy became the site of a vicious attack. Rioters chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," as a noose and gallows were built a stone's throw from the Capitol steps. Capitol police officers were beaten and sprayed with pepper spray. Attackers hunted down lawmakers to hold them hostage or worse. Staff barricaded doors. People sent text messages to their families to tell them they loved them. They thought they were saying goodbye, Mr. Speaker. This was not a protest. This was an insurrection. This was a well-organized attack on our country that was incited by Donald Trump. Domestic terrorists broke into the United States Capitol that day, and it's a miracle more people didn't die. As my colleagues and I were being evacuated to safety, I never, ever will forget what I saw when I looked into the eyes of those attackers right in the Speaker's lobby there. I saw evil, Mr. Speaker. Our country came under attack, not from a foreign nation, but from within. These were not protesters. These were not patriots. These were traitors. These were domestic terrorists, Mr. Speaker. And they were acting under the orders of Donald Trump. Now, some of my colleagues on the other side have suggested that we just move on from this horror. But to gloss over it would be an abdication of our duty. Others on the Republican side have talked about unity. But we can't have unity without truth and without accountability. And I'm not about to be lectured by people who just voted to overturn the results of a free and fair election. America was attacked, and we must respond, even when the cause of this violence resides at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Each of us took an oath last week. It wasn't to a party, and it wasn't to a person. We vowed to defend the Constitution. The actions of Donald Trump have called each of us to fulfill that oath today. I pray that we rise to this responsibility, because every moment Donald Trump is in the White House, our nation, our freedom is in danger. He must be held to account for the attack on our Capitol that he organized and he incited. I solemnly urge my colleagues to support this rule and the underlying article. The damage this building sustained can be repaired, Mr. Speaker. But if we don't hold Donald Trump accountable, the damage done to our nation could be irreversible. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I begin my formal remarks, I want to ask for God's blessing and protection on you, for my friend Mr. McGovern, for all who come to this chamber today to speak and to vote, for our wonderful staff that makes this possible, and most especially for the men and women of the Capitol Police and the other affiliated law enforcement agencies that are here to protect everybody and to make sure that this proceeding can go forward. With that, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Massachusetts, my very good friend, distinguished chairman of the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, today is a sad day for all of us. For me personally, for the Rules Committee, for the entire House of Representatives, and most certainly for the American people. For the second time in 13 months, we're meeting to discuss the impeachment of the President of the United States. Our meeting today does not arise in a vacuum and comes at what I hope and pray is the end of a tumultuous period for our country. Less than 1 week ago, Congress met to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election. What started out as peaceful protest turned into a riot as an untold number of individuals stormed the Capitol building. 6 people died as a result of this mob, and it's only by the grace of God and the brave acts of the U.S. Capitol Police, the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police, the FBI, the ATF, and other responding agencies that there was not more bloodshed. Violent acts such as these have no place in our republic. These shocking and sobering events rest high on our minds today, as well they should. Certainly January 6, 2021 will live in my memory as the darkest day during my time of service as a member of this House. After these grave events, we as a nation and as an institution have an opportunity to come together. President Trump has conceded the 2020 election. Congress has certified the results of the election. And next Wednesday, President-elect Biden will be sworn in as the President of the United States. Congress and the nation can move forward knowing that the political process was completed as designed and the constitutional framework that has governed our republic since 1789 held firm. But instead of moving forward as a unifying force, the majority in the House is choosing to divide us further. With only a week to go in his term, the majority is asking us to consider a resolution impeaching President Trump. And they do so knowing full well that even if the House passes this resolution, the Senate will not be able to begin considering these charges until after President Trump's term ends. Mr. Speaker, I can think of no action the House can take that's more likely to further divide the American people than the action we are contemplating today. Emotions are clearly running high, and political divisions have never been more apparent in my lifetime. We desperately need to seek a path forward, healing for the American people. So it's unfortunate that a path to support healing is not the path the majority's chosen today. Instead, the House is moving forward erratically with a truncated process that does not comport with the modern practice and that will give members no time to contemplate the serious course of action before us. In every modern impeachment inquiry, an investigation and committee action has preceded bringing an impeachment resolution to the floor. In part, this is to ensure that members have the full facts, the opportunity to engage expert witnesses, and have a chance to be heard. It also provides due process to the President of the United States. And again, in every modern impeachment inquiry, the President has been given an opportunity to be heard in some form or another. This is necessary in order to ensure that the American people have confidence in the procedures the House is following. It's also necessary not because of the President's inappropriate and reckless words are deserving of defense, but because the presidency itself demands due process in the impeachment proceedings. Unfortunately, the majority's chosen to race to the floor with a new article of impeachment, foregoing any investigation, any committee process, or any chance for members to fully contemplate this course of action before proceeding. Professor Jonathan Turley is correct when he called this a, quote, dangerous snap impeachment, an impeachment that effectively would go to a vote without the deliberation or inquiries of the traditional hearing. Professor Turley also noted that, quote, the damage caused by the rioters this week was enormous. However, it will pale in comparison to the damage from a new precedent of a snap impeachment, unquote. If the majority is seeking consensus, this is hardly the way to create it. The majority is failing to provide the House with an opportunity to review all the facts, which are still coming to light, to discuss all the evidence, to listen to scholars, to examine the witnesses, and to consider precedents. This is not the type of robust process we have followed for every modern impeachment, and the failure to do so does a great disservice to this institution and to this country. Mr. Speaker, I can think of nothing that will cause further division more than the path the majority is now taking. Rather than looking ahead to a new administration, the majority is again seeking to settle scores against the old one. Rather than seeking to heal America, they are seeking to divide us more deeply. And rather than following the appropriate processes the House has used in every modern impeachment, the majority is rushing to the floor, tripping all over themselves in their rush to impeach the President a second time. What's worse, though the majority seems to believe that this course of action is self-evident, and that's simply not the case. I have to tell them it's not. Members that have reviewed the same conduct and have come to dramatically different conclusions. Legal scholars like Professor Turley and Professor Alan Dershowitz, both of whom condemned the President's statements, believe that his statements are not impeachable. I know other scholars have different points of view. Given this difference of opinion, shouldn't we have a better process than this? Shouldn't we have a chance to examine witnesses, discuss the matter with legal scholars, and consider this in committee? On a matter as grave and consequential as impeachment, shouldn't we follow the same process we have used in every modern impeachment rather than rushing to the floor? On behalf of generations of Americans to come, we need to think more clearly about the consequences of our actions today. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, there is no reason to rush forward like this, other than the very obvious fact that there are only 7 days left until a new president takes office. But what's worse, as Professor Dershowitz has pointed out, because of the Senate's rules, the case cannot come to trial in the Senate until 1 p.m. on January the 20th, 1 hour after President Trump leaves office. This is an ill-advised course, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker. Even Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat, agrees. Senator Manchin is quoted this week as having said, quote, "I think this is so ill-advised for Joe Biden to be coming in, trying to heal the country, trying to be the president of all the people when we're going to be so divided and fighting again. Let the judicial system do its job," unquote. So what then is the point of the rush to impeach? We are coming off a horrific event that resulted in 6 deaths. We have an opportunity to move forward, but we cannot if the majority insists on bringing the country through the trauma of another impeachment. It will carry forward into the next president's term, ensuring that he will struggle to organize his administration. What's worse, it will continue to generate the bitterness so many of us have opposed. Why put us through that when we can't actually resolve this before the end of the president's term? Mr. Speaker, I think my colleagues in the majority need to think about this more soberly. We need to recognize we are following a flawed process. We need to recognize that people of goodwill can differ. We need to recognize that while the House may be done with this matter after today's vote, it will not be done for the country. It will not be done for the Senate, and it will not be done for the incoming Biden administration. The House's action today will only extend the division longer than necessary. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would note that there are other remedies that can be pursued. The President is expected to face litigation over his role in last Wednesday's events. There will be criminal proceedings against the perpetrators, and I hope all of those who stormed the Capitol will be brought to justice. And some members have proposed an alternative procedure, censoring the President, which could garner significant bipartisan support in the House. I do not think impeachment is a wise course, Mr. Speaker. I would urge my friends in the majority to reconsider. There's still time to choose a different path, one that leads to reconciliation and hope for a better and brighter days. With that, I urge opposition to the rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the powerful statement by Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who is the chair of the House Republican Caucus, entitled, "I will vote to impeach the President."
Without objection.
And I just want to be clear about one thing. If we vote to impeach the President today and we send it over to the Senate, there is nothing to prevent the Senate from taking it up immediately if Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell decides that he wants to proceed, number one. Number two, we all want to talk about unity. I can't think of anything that would unify this country more if there was a big bipartisan vote in favor of impeachment. Every second that this president remains in office is a danger to this country and to the world. We have no idea what he is capable of doing, whether he will pardon these terrorists, whether he will go to war. So I would urge all my colleagues on both sides to support this rule and the impeachment resolution. I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu.
He's recognized for 1 minute.
Last week, I hid in an office for hours, terrified to open the door because I did not know if a rioter was on the other side ready to attack, kidnap, or murder me. But my experiences were just the tip of the iceberg. The U.S. Capitol was targeted, besieged, and ransacked on January 6th by a murderous mob holding a noose for Vice President Pence and targeting Speaker Pelosi. Their rampage resulted in destruction and 5 people dead. We were attacked by terrorists, but this time the terrorists were radicalized right here in the United States. Worse, they were radicalized by the president, who intentionally lied to his supporters that the election was stolen and then told them when to come to D.C., where to protest, and who to direct their anger at. The need to remove this president could not be more urgent. He is too dangerous to remain in office. Donald Trump must be held accountable. He must be impeached.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we defeat the previous question, I'll offer an amendment to the rule to immediately bring up a resolution establishing a bipartisan national commission on the domestic terrorist attack on the United States Capitol. This proposed bipartisan commission will be tasked with examining and reporting upon the terror attack on our Capitol that occurred last Wednesday. The commission will be bipartisan in nature, modeled after the 9/11 Commission, and will fully be empowered to undertake a full investigation and make recommendations to the President and to Congress. I can think of no more appropriate path for Congress to follow than by ensuring a bipartisan commission reviews all evidence and reports back to us on this horrific event. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record, along with extraneous material, immediately prior to the vote on the previous question. With that, I
Without
urge...
objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I urge a no vote on the previous question. I yield 4 minutes to my good friend, Mr. Davis of Illinois, the ranking Republican member on House Administration, for a further explanation of this amendment.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first want to thank the U.S. Capitol Police and the Sergeant-at-Arms employees who were here on the front lines protecting this Capitol last week during the unprecedented attack. It is imperative that we focus on ensuring a safe Inauguration Day, protecting members and staff during this time of increased threats, and making sure that our Capitol Police officers have the support that they need. We need to ensure that what we saw happen a week ago today never happens again. Yesterday, I introduced, along with Representatives Katko and Comer, a bill that would create a national commission on the domestic terrorist attack upon the United States Capitol. The bipartisan commission would consist of 10 members, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, appointed by the next president and by House and Senate leadership. This commission would be tasked with investigating the domestic terrorist attack that occurred in this building just a week ago. And it will provide us recommendations to prevent similar attacks from happening in the future. What we saw last week scared all of us who were here, but it also showed adversaries what it takes to take out a branch of government. When this commission is done with this investigation, it will submit a report to the President and to Congress detailing its findings and recommendations to ensure that no foreign or domestic adversary could accomplish what was done on January 6th. We need to ensure that we fully understand what took place last week and any and all issues that occurred during our response. Republicans and Democrats need to work together. We must unite to prevent any attacks like this from happening in the future, and we must protect this institution, not just for us, for the American people. That's why we should defeat the previous question so that we can establish this bipartisan commission to equip us with the information that we need to support our Capitol Police and the men and women who work in these buildings. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, the Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman of the Rules Committee for yielding. I congratulate him for his efforts and that of the Rules Committee in acting swiftly. I appreciate the remarks of Mr. Cole, for whom I have great respect, but I disagree with his sense of a lack of urgency in action. I do agree with him of the consequences of our action. There are consequences to actions, and the actions of the President of the United States demand urgent, clear action by the Congress of the United States. The chairman of the committee introduced the remarks and put them in the record. But I want to reference the remarks of the chair of the Republican Conference, which is the analog to the Democratic Caucus. It is all the Republicans elected to the Congress of the United States in the House of Representatives. And they elected Liz Cheney, the daughter of the Vice President of the United States. the former whip of this House, Dick Cheney, with whom I served in the 80s. Representative Cheney from Wyoming, a conservative Republican, said this: "The President of the United States summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack." That is not some irresponsible new member of the Congress of the United States. This is the daughter of the former Republican whip and former Vice President of the United States of America. She knows of what she speaks. And she said this as well: "There has never been a greater betrayal by a President of the United States of his office and his oath of Constitution, to the Constitution." This is not, as Liz Cheney says, just some action. She characterized it as the biggest betrayal of any President of the United States in our history. Mr. John Katko, not a backbench Republican who just got here and doesn't know what's going on. Mr. John Katko, who is the ranking Republican on the Homeland Security Committee, says this: "To allow the President of the United States to incite this attack without consequences is a direct threat to the future of democracy." This is not some backbencher on your side of the aisle, on their side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker. It reflects the sense of outrage, the sense of historic dissimilarity from the actions of any previous president. And then Mr. Adam Kinzinger, member to the NG Commerce Committee, a senior member from Illinois. So I have a member from Wyoming, a member from Illinois, and a member from New York. There will be others on this vote who will join them. And Mr. Kinzinger said this: if these actions, he hasn't had any hearings, he doesn't need any long, drawn-out consideration. If these actions are not worthy of impeachment, then what is an impeachable offense? There is no doubt in my mind that the President of the United States broke his oath and incited this insurrection. I tell my friend, Mr. Speaker, a gentleman for whom I have great respect, he is my friend, and I say that honestly, not just as rhetoric, as we say on this floor, because there's some that I don't consider friends, whose values I do not share. That is not Mr. Cole. We have a difference. Liz Cheney, John Katko, Adam Kinzinger, and other Republicans whom I have talked to within the last 24 hours believe this action is required. Now, let me say, I see the gentleman from Ohio is on the floor. He likes to say that we Democrats were elected and the first thing we wanted to do was impeach this president. And he's shaking his head in agreement because, like the President of the United States, he denies the facts. Trump-like. Fake news. December 6, 2017. Mr. Green, whom I'm going to refer to, offered a motion because he saw the danger that confronted our country. And he filed a resolution of impeachment. And on December 6, 2017, we had a vote on that. And the majority of Democrats voted no. Actually, they voted yes to table, so that we did not proceed in 2017. The gentleman from Texas. Mr. Green thought, however, the next year that there was still a danger to our country. Some of us shared that view, but we were not confident that the case could be made or that the transactions that had proceeded would lead to conviction. So on January 19th of 2018, we had a motion to table Mr. Green's resolution. And the majority of Democrats voted to table that resolution. What a rush to judgment. And then on July 17th, 2019, 9 days before the call to Ukraine to get the Ukrainian leader to act on the political behalf of the President of the United States and withheld money to defend the Ukrainian people from Russian involvement and offered that as a bribe. And on July 17th, the majority of Democrats voted to table that resolution. So, Mr. Speaker, there was no rush to judgment. And then that call to which I just referred was on July 26th, 9 days later. I call that the aha moment. Yes, I knew what I thought, but that was proof. And the gentleman, some gentlemen have lamented that we didn't know the whistleblower, because after all, if we knew the whistleblower, we could intimidate everybody else from coming forward. And this president has done everything he can to intimidate whistleblowers, people who came forward and told the truth. And we had witness after witness after witness who confirmed what the whistleblower brought to our attention. So the reason I rise today, and I'm going to speak on the resolution itself at some later time, is to recognize the contributions that Al Green of Texas has made to getting us to this place. And I just want to, I'm not going to read all the resolution, but I want to read some excerpts from the resolution he has introduced. We won't be considering his resolution. We'll be considering Mr. Cicilline and over 200 others who have signed on to the resolution. Mr. Green had a resolution when introduced, resolved that Donald Trump, President of the United States, is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, and the following articles of impeachment be exhibited in the Senate. Article 1 says, in his conduct with the President of the, in his conduct while President of the United States, unmindful of the high duties of his high office and dignity and proprieties thereof, and of the harmony and courtesies necessary for stability, to which my friend spoke, the gentleman from Oklahoma, John Trump, in violation of his constitutional and oath faithfully to execute the office of President, has harmed the society of the United States, brought shame and dishonor to the office of the President of the United States, sowing discord among the people of the United States by weaponizing hate for political gain. He went on to say on January 6, 2021, in a speech at the National Mall, President Donald Trump weaponized the hate and that resulted in violence, the deaths of multiple people, an assault on democracy, and an insurrection against the Capitol of the United States of America by inciting a mob. Who said that? Liz Cheney said it, and Al Green said it. Infected with white supremacists, carrying a rebel flag, erecting a gallows structure with a noose, wearing shirts and hateful messages, such as Camp Auschwitz, work brings freedom, and MAGA Civil War, January 6, 2021. MAGA Civil War. They had the hats on of the army of MAGA, which I refer to as Make America Grieve Again. We grieved at Fort Sumter. We grieved on December 7th, 1941, and we grieved on 9/11. And yes, we grieved on January 6th of this year. He goes on to say what the president told this mob that Liz Cheney said was recruited by the President of the United States. And I quote, this is the president talking to this mob. All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by a bold and radical left Democrats, like the Secretary of State in Georgia and the governor of Georgia, which is what they are doing, and stolen by the fake news media, inciting, riling up, creating anger with the fake news and lies that the President of the United States said to these folks. That is what they have done and what they are doing, the President continued. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. And so what did they do? Incited by this president, as Liz Cheney said, as John Katko said, as Adam Kinzinger said, and frankly, what Secretary Chao acted upon, and what the Secretary of Homeland Security acted upon, and what so many others in the administration have acted upon. Disgusted, dismayed, and disheartened by what their president had done. They got out. They quit. The president further emboldened them, saying, this is the green resolution. We're not considering it, but it is the green resolution. The president further emboldened them, saying, you will never take back our country with weakness. We had a display of non-weakness, criminal, insurrection-like conduct, recruited by and deployed by the President of the United States to come to this Capitol and stop the steal. The steal, of course, was we assembled accepting what all the courts that considered it said was a fair and accurate election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as President and Vice President of the United States. After his National Mall speech, a mob of his supporters proceeded to the Capitol complex. We know that. And so Mr. Green's resolution ends with, wherefore, to prevent national harm to our society, Donald John Trump, by such conduct, warrants immediate impeachment trial and removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States Constitution and the 14th Amendment. So in conclusion, Mr. Green is going to speak after me, but in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, let me tell my friend Mr. Cole, I've been here some time. He has as well. I've served with Ronald Reagan, with George H.W. Bush, and George Bush. I had respect for all of those presidents. They cared about our country, they honored our Constitution, and they executed the duties of their office consistent with the Constitution and laws of our country. That is not true of this president. And therefore, he ought to be removed. And we have that opportunity to do so. Is there little time left? Yes. But it is never too late to do the right thing. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Speaker, At this point, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, my good friend, Mr. Green.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had tears to well in my eyes as I heard Mr. Hoyer, and I know that hearts are hurting. It's a very sad time in the history of our country. No one is celebrating. No one wants to see this occur. I was at the Rules Committee by way of Zoom. I was there for the entire hearing. Those members on the other side, this is something that they understand and they take seriously. Regardless as to what's said, I could sense that they're hurting too. So I just want to thank everyone for all that has happened and the appreciation that's been shown. And I want to say that the healing that we talk about, that has to begin. May I have just 30 seconds?
I yield the gentleman 30 seconds.
Gentleman has additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. The healing, it has to start with some of these people who were there initially, who helped to lay this foundation, 110 people. I want to recognize Maxine Waters, Congresswoman. A lot of them were threatened. Their lives were disrupted. And if I may, with unanimous consent, I'd just like to insert their names in the record.
Without objection.
I thank you, and may God bless our country as we go forward.
Gentleman from Texas yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my good friend, distinguished Republican member, our leader of the Budget Committee, Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we defeat the previous question, we will amend the rule to immediately bring up the bill establishing a bipartisan national commission on the domestic terror attack of the United States Capitol. This has been a devastating week for our nation. Just last week, we stood right here in this very chamber while a violent mob laid siege to the seat of American democracy. It is vital we get the facts on what went wrong last week, why the security apparatus failed, and how we can ensure it never happens again. Less than 50 feet from where we stand in this room, a young lady lost her life through those doors. Through those doors. I was in this chamber when those gunshots rang. That is real stuff. That should never happen in the people's house. For the first time, can the House Democrats and the Speaker of the House put the people before politics? Please put the people before politics. At a time when our nation is more divided than ever before, let's put people before politics. President Trump will be leaving in 7 days. Let's try to heal this nation. Let's listen to the American people. This is the people's house. Let's operate for the people. This country is hurting. The people are hurting. Our colleagues are hurting. This is a reckless impeachment. This will only bring up the hate and fire more than ever before. Have a conscience. Put the people before politics.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me remind all of my colleagues that what happened on Wednesday would not have happened if it weren't for the occupant in the White House. And if we want to put the people first, we all ought to vote to impeach him and remove him from office as soon as possible. With that, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Brownlee.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, today is a defining moment in our history. Congress was attacked by a mob directed by the President of the United States. It was a horrible, terrifying situation, but we all know deep in our hearts that it could have been much, much worse. We simply cannot let it stand. We cannot let it stand for the very soul of our democracy. We cannot let the President of the United States leave office without acting. We are the oldest constitutional republic in the world, and our Capitol is the sacred symbol of our great democracy. To my colleagues across the aisle, I appeal to your sense of service and duty to our nation and to the oath we all swore to uphold. Before we are Democrats and Republicans, we are Americans. Let us come together to fulfill our oath by voting for the resolution before us and by defending, preserving, and honoring our democracy. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to one of our new members, distinguished gentlelady from South Carolina, Ms. Mace, and note that this is her first speech on the House floor.
Gentlewoman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is not the reason why I wanted to give my first speech in our chambers, in our hallowed halls. This is not what I wanted to do in my first week in office. But after the violent events of last week, watching and witnessing how heartbreaking this was, thank God I sent my kids home on Monday morning because I was worried about the rhetoric leading up to the events and to the rally on January 6th, the violence that could transpire. Not only were our lives in danger, but if my kids were here, their lives would have been in danger too, the two most precious people in my life. Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States, the U.S. House of Representatives has every right to impeach the President of the United States. But what we're doing today, rushing this impeachment in an hour or 2 hour long debate on the floor of this chamber, bypassing judiciary, poses great questions about the constitutionality of this process. I believe we need to hold the President accountable. I hold him accountable for the events that transpired, for the attack on our Capitol last Wednesday. I also believe that we need to hold accountable every single person, even members of Congress, if they contributed to the violence that transpired here. But today I'm asking my colleagues to remember the words of the legendary, the great leader in this country, Dr. Martin Luther King, who once said, "The time is always right to do what is right." And if we're serious about healing the divisions in this country, Republicans and Democrats need to acknowledge this is not the first day of violence we've seen. We've seen violence across our country for the last 9 months. And we need to recognize, number one, that our words have consequences, that there is violence on both sides of the aisle. We've contributed to it. We need to take responsibility for our words and our actions. We need to acknowledge there is a problem, take responsibility for it, and stop being part of the problem and start being part of the solution. God bless every member in the chamber today, and God bless the United States of America. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh.
Gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, our government is founded on the principle all power flows from the people. Donald Trump challenged this principle in 2 ways: deceit and violence. The deceit is repeated and baseless assertion of an electoral fraud. The violence, the attack on the United States Capitol on January 6th. The mob was assembled by Donald Trump, incited by Donald Trump, and in service of Donald Trump's effort to overturn, through violence, what he lost at the voting booth. The violent mob breached the Capitol, killed and injured Capitol Police, destroyed property, threatened the Vice President, members of Congress, and staff, all to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power. If we want unity, we must have accountability. So the question before this Congress: will Congress condone through acquiescence or condemn through impeachment Donald Trump's violent acts to overturn the election?
Gentleman's
Congress
time has
must
expired.
impeach.
Gentleman from Massachusetts
I yield
is
back.
reserved. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished Republican leader of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jordan of Ohio.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, in his opening remarks, the Democrat chair of the Rules Committee said that Republicans last week voted to overturn the results of an election. Guess who the first objector was on January 6, 2017? First objector, the Democrat chair of the Rules Committee. And guess which state he objected to? Alabama. The very first state called, Alabama. President Trump, I think, won Alabama by like 80 points. Actually, he won it by 30 points. They can object to Alabama in 2017, but tell us we can't object to Pennsylvania in 2021? Pennsylvania, where the state Supreme Court just unilaterally extended the election to Friday? Pennsylvania, where the Secretary of State unilaterally changed the rules, went around the legislature in unconstitutional fashion? Pennsylvania, where county clerks in some counties, and you can imagine which counties they were, let people fix their ballots against the law, cure their ballots, their mail-in ballots, direct violation of the law. And they tell us we tried to overturn the election. Guess who the second objector was in 2017? The individual managing the impeachment for the Democrats. Americans are tired of the double standard. They are so tired of it. Democrats object to more states in 2017 than Republicans did last week, but somehow we're wrong. Democrats can raise bail for rioters and looters this summer, but somehow when Republicans condemn all the violence this summer, the violence last week, somehow we're wrong. And Democrats can investigate the President of the United States, as Mr. Hoyer went through, try to impeach him, investigate him for 4 years, but will not look at an election that 80 million Americans, half the electorate, 80 million, Republicans and Democrats have their doubts about. I said this last night. I do not know where all this goes, and this is frightening for the country. We should defeat this rule, and we should defeat the impeachment resolution when it comes up.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, some of us objected 4 years ago as a protest vote to raise concerns about what all of our intelligence agencies had stated clearly, that Russia interfered in our election. But what the gentleman fails to acknowledge is that we all acknowledged that Donald Trump was the president the day after the election. Hillary Clinton conceded the day after the election. None of us pushed conspiracy theories like some of my friends on the other side of the aisle have been doing, and this president, that somehow the president won in a landslide. Give me a break. You know, yesterday in the Rules Committee, I asked the gentleman from Ohio if he would just say 5 simple words. And if he was talking about healing. I said the 5 simple words that you could say that would help heal this nation are that the election was not stolen. That's it. 5 simple words. He refused. He said he never said the election was stolen. Well, the evidence shows otherwise. And let me quote from this Dana Milbank piece entitled, "5 Pesky Little Words Keep Stumping Jim Jordan." And Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is this. This Capitol was stormed. People died because of the big lies that were being told by this president and by too many people on the other side of the aisle. Enough. People should be outraged as to what happened. It was unforgivable, unconscionable. And coming up on this floor and talking about whataboutism and trying to make these false equivalencies, give me a break. The President of the United States instigated an attempted coup in this country. People died. Everybody should be outraged, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. If this is not an impeachable offense, I don't know what the hell is. This president is not fit to remain in office. With that, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. This was not a one-off. It was a long time coming. It was a part of a plan to perpetuate Trump in office. Trump's campaign strategy was the election, the only way we can lose is if it's stolen. If it's stolen, it's fake, it's stolen, repeated by many of his fellow travelers on that side more than 150 times by Trump over the summer. Then they litigated to disqualify voters. That didn't work. Then they litigated to throw out ballots. Well, that didn't work. Then they attempted to delay the count and flip state legislatures. Well, that didn't work. Last ditch, the president called down to Georgia and said, "Can't you find me more votes?" And then one last desperate plea: stop the January 6th certification. And the president talked about that on September 26th. He said, "You know, if it goes to Congress, there's one vote per state, and we have an advantage." So I think this was part of a plan to disrupt the Electoral College of the United States. Giuliani, trial by combat. Trump, never take back our country with weakness.
Gentleman's time's expired.
You have to show
Gentleman
strength.
from
You have to be
Massachusetts
strong.
reserves.
If you
The
don't
gentleman
fight like
from
hell, you're not gonna
Oklahoma
have a
is
country
recognized. The
anymore.
gentleman will
And then
suspend.
he said, "We love
The
you."
gentleman is no longer recognized. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Reschenthaler, new member of the Rules Committee.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm deeply troubled by last week's attack on our Capitol, and I pray for the families of Officer Sicknick and Officer Liebengood. As I have been saying all summer long, violence and rioting has no place in America, and the criminals responsible for last week's rioting must be brought to justice. At a time when our nation is still healing, we must seek out issues to work on that unite us, rather than issues that further divide us. I was greatly encouraged to see our country unite in condemnation of last week's lawlessness and the rioting. I am further encouraged that despite my Democrat colleagues' claims to the contrary, President Trump is committed to a peaceful and uninterrupted transfer of power. But that's not good enough for my colleagues across the aisle. With just 7 days left in President Trump's term, they are fast-tracking impeachment proceedings, a move which will no doubt further divide an already fractured nation. Even House Democrats' last impeachment effort, which was rushed through in record time, at the very least that had expert input, depositions, hearings, and deliberation. This latest attempt at impeachment ignores all precedent and ignores all due process. And it cannot be voted on in the Senate before Joe Biden is sworn into office. I'm also very concerned by the charge against the president of quote-unquote incitement of insurrection. At his rally, President Trump urged attendees to quote-unquote peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. There was no mention of violence, let alone calls to action. Look, I prosecuted terrorists in the Navy. I was a defense attorney in the Navy JAG Corps. I was a district judge. Just pull up the criminal statute. Look at the criminal code. President Trump's words would not even meet the definition of incitement under criminal statutes. The measure before us today sets a dangerous precedent whereby political parties can justify impeachment simply because they do not agree with the president. I would therefore urge my colleagues across the aisle to just take a step back, let cooler heads prevail, and consider how the actions we're taking here today will alter the course of history, will lower an already low bar of impeachment for all future presidencies. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, when my friends talk about the president being committed to a peaceful transition, I just point to what happened on Wednesday when his words launched a violent attack against this Capitol, where 5 people lost their lives and many more were injured. So give me a break. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
I thank you. Contrary to my good friend's words, the President of the United States is an insurrectionist. He led an insurrection against the United States of America. Prior to the January 6th attack by violent domestic terrorists, the President spoke to the crowd for 1 hour, and these were his words. These were his words, which is that we cannot take the nation back. We have to take the nation back with strength, and you must go and do that. Those were the paraphrase of his words. The President provoked these domestic terrorists with words, with actions, and conduct that portray and have contempt and hostility to the national value of equal justice under the law, telling domestic terrorists, nearly all of them were white supremacists, many of them, who support him politically, who stormed the Capitol to derail Congress from completing its constitutionally required duty of counting and verifying the votes.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my very good friend, the distinguished member of Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to this effort to move forward with impeachment hearings. What happened on Wednesday, January 6th, was nothing short of pure anarchy. And those individuals who broke the law should be held accountable for their actions. They should be prosecuted to the highest extent of the law, and they should be put in jail. This was one of the saddest days of my life last Wednesday, Mr. Chairman. Our thoughts and our prayers are with the police officers and other law enforcement who carried out their duties on that tragic day, including Officers Sicknick and Liebengood. Right now, our focus should be on healing our nation. With so many upset and dismayed at the actions of last week, it's our responsibility to chart a path forward to subdue the growing animosity and find ways to heal our country. Unfortunately, I don't believe this resolution will achieve those goals, especially 7 days ahead of the inauguration. This is very serious and concerning effort during such a tense and fragile time in our country. I urge my colleagues to consider how this will further entrench people during such a tense time. I cannot support this.
The gentleman will suspend. All members are reminded to wear face coverings while on the floor. All members and staff should be wearing face coverings while on the floor. Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
For years, Donald Trump has honored thugs worldwide who suppress democracy. For months, with a daily diet of lies, he has made clear his refusal to accept any election in which he was not the winner. After failing completely in his repeated attempts to intimidate both Republican election officials into committing fraud and Republican-appointed judges into ignoring our Constitution, he made a desperate attempt last week to block the final election count and prevent the peaceful transition of power essential to democracy. Trump basically attempted to overthrow the government, to violently overthrow the first branch of government, this Congress. Like his deadly reaction to the pandemic, he totally bungled the deadly attack. Both his frenzied, riotous mob and his congressional enablers were defeated. America, we did stop the steal. We stopped Donald Trump from stealing our democracy and imposing himself as a tyrant. Today, we not only demand accountability for his gross misconduct, but more importantly, we declare to the next Trump-like aspiring tyrant, not in America, we love our democracy too much. Our capital is scarred, but our democracy survives. Violating his sworn duty to protect and defend our Constitution by seeking to violently overthrow the government.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts
if this is
reserves.
not impeachable,
the gentleman
nothing
from
is.
Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I advise the chair I have additional speakers on the way, but they're having a difficult time, so I will reserve my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro.
Gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
On November 3rd, the American people voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to serve as President and Vice President of the United States. The country was about to enter a new era with great hope for change. And yet, with a decisive mandate and majority, the President used untruthful claims to end the completion of a constitutional process of collecting the electoral votes, making Joe Biden President of the United States. Not accepting the will of the American people, the President unleashed the most horrific violence that overwhelmed the security forces at this Capitol, which was overrun for the first time since 1812, putting the lives of so many at risk. Indeed, a day of infamy. This impeachment will be viewed as a transcendent vote where all will be judged. Vote to impeach. the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is
I
recognized.
continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserved. From Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to urge the impeachment of Donald Trump because the attack on the Capitol and the Congress was the single most depraved betrayal of the U.S. Constitution ever committed by a president. The traitorous incitement of an insurrection demands not just impeachment, but removal of from office immediately. Violence during the transfer of power, Confederate flags, anti-Semitic paraphernalia desecrated this Capitol. So accountability must come swiftly. We must act with the same resoluteness we showed in the early morning hours after the insurrection, where we ensured the will of the voters was effectuated. Donald Trump's defilement of this Capitol will not stand. It demands impeachment now. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my very good friend, the distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman from North Carolina. is recognized
Excuse me,
for
2
1
minutes,
minute.
Mr. Speaker.
For 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. These articles charge incitement. Once before, the House impeached a president of the United States within a week of the alleged offense. That was President Andrew Johnson, days after he removed Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in 1868. Over 50 years later, the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional the Tenure of Office Act that President Johnson had refused to obey. In other words, the House was not only hasty, it was wrong, punishing noncompliance with an unconstitutional law. At least when that occurred, the constitutionality of the law in question was unsettled. Here, however, an angry House majority races to impeachment in direct violation of settled constitutional law. Again, the articles before the House charge incitement to insurrection. They do not specify inciting language. The law is well settled. Quote, "What is required to forfeit constitutional protection is incitement speech that specifically advocates for listeners to take unlawful action." The violence last Wednesday was abhorrent. Perpetrators should be prosecuted. Those responsible for security decisions held accountable. Congress can disapprove, revile, condemn, even censure, but you cannot, consistent with the rule of law, punish that which the Constitution's First Amendment declares protected. If you do it, the violators of duty to this Constitution, however angry, will be those who vote for this article of impeachment. It is not Mr. Green's article of impeachment. It is incitement. And the Constitution is settled on that point. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Speaker, let us not mince words about what happened last week. It was a violent attempt to interrupt our democratic process. It was a targeted blow at the most essential process that makes us a democracy. It was a direct and specifically incited by the President of the United States. For years, we have been asked to turn a blind eye to the criminality, corruption, and blatant disregard to the rule of law by the tyrant president we have in the White House. We as a nation can no longer look away. The president not only incited an insurrection against our government, but has in word and deed led a rebellion. We cannot simply move past this or turn the page. For us to be able to survive as a functioning democracy, there has to be accountability. We must impeach and remove this president from the office immediately so that he cannot be a threat to our democracy. I stand ready to fulfill my oath of office, and I challenge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to do the same. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a New York Times article published January 9th entitled, "Our President Wants Us Here, the Mob That Stormed the Capitol." It's another example of why our country cannot risk even one more day of Donald Trump.
Without objection.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, last week, Congress was under siege by a mob, motivated and directed by the President of the United States. Our Vice President was the target of that mob. Members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, were targets of this mob. And I witnessed, for the first time in my life, Americans fighting Americans, all at the behest of our own President of the United States. And as Americans, we can do better. And I will vote for impeachment today for our nation, for our children, and for our grandchildren. And I'll be voting for impeachment so that America will once again be the shining city upon the hill whose beacon light guides freedom-loving people everywhere. I urge my colleagues to join me and vote for impeachment. With that, I yield.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
May I ask the gentleman how many more speakers he may have?
Whenever the gentleman is prepared to close, we'll close. We were hopeful that one of our speakers could arrive, but difficult circumstances, they're just having a hard time getting here.
I think we have exhausted all of our speakers, so I'll yield to the gentleman.
Is my friend prepared to close?
Yes.
Then I'll close, Mr.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time. Speaker, I want to thank you for presiding over these difficult proceedings today. I want to thank my good friend, the distinguished chairman of the Rules Committee, and I want to thank everybody that came to the floor, had something to say at an important moment. And I think the debate, while spirited, reflected the civility and decency of the institution that we're all privileged to be part of. And I'm very proud to have been part of it, very proud of all the members and the manner in which they participated. I want again to thank the staff and thank those who kept us safe in the process, particularly the Capitol Police. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I oppose this rule and I oppose the majority's actions today. After the traumatic events of last week, the majority should be taking steps to unite us. Instead, they are only dividing us further. They are rushing to judgment, in my opinion, and bringing up impeachment after failing to follow any meaningful process whatsoever. No hearings have been held, no witnesses heard, no process or opportunity to respond was provided to the President. No members had an opportunity to review or amend this article before it came to the floor. This is hardly the way the House should undertake such a serious act. Mr. Speaker, there's still a way to unite the country. Let us look forward, not backward. Let us come together, not apart. Let us celebrate the peaceful transition of power to a new president rather than impeaching an old president. And let us affirm and reaffirm with one united voice that the House does not rush to judgment on the most consequential action we can take. We deserve better than that, Mr. Speaker, and the American people deserve better than that. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues, as they reflect on this minute and we move into our next stage of debate, to remember that we're all privileged to represent a great and a good people who've gone through a horrifying and tragic time, and that we owe them the opportunity to reflect, and we owe them our best efforts to bring together. I know people on this floor feel very passionately about this subject with different points of view. I honor each one of those points of view, and I honor the people that voice them. Let's remember when we're through this that we're one people, that we have one purpose, that we're free through the grace of God and millions of brave Americans over centuries of time, and we will remain that way, and we will move forward together once we settle this debate. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no on the previous question, no on the rule, no on the underlying measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank my friend, the ranking member of the Rules Committee, Mr. Cole, for his friendship and for the way he conducts himself in this chamber. I know he has great respect for this institution. Mr. Speaker, it is impossible for me to fully capture the reverence that I have for the United States Capitol. You know, I worked on these grounds starting back when I was a college intern, working for Senator George McGovern back in 1977. No relation. Great last name. But since that time, I have done everything from working as a staffer for Congressman Joe Moakley of Massachusetts to being elected to the United States House of Representatives myself. But that internship will always be a high point of my life. Coming here for the first time, walking these hallowed halls, and seeing the glory of American democracy up close. The idea that someone would incite an out-of-control mob of homegrown fascists and domestic terrorists to desecrate the People's House fills me with a deep sadness for our country. The contempt that these people had for our democracy and our freedom fills me with horror. And what Donald Trump did, encouraging them, fills me with rage. Rage, not just on behalf of all of those serving here, but all of those who work in these halls. And I'm talking about the reporters, the cafeteria workers, the custodians, the clerks, the parliamentarians. I go on and on and on. And the staff, the Democratic staff, the Republican staff, the nonpartisan support staff, who were terrorized, some hiding under their desks and barricading in their offices. I was in the Speaker's chair the day this unfolded, and many of the people who are sitting up there now were present at that time. What a horrifying thing for anybody to have to experience. Now, some of my Republican friends have been trying to lecture us about unity here today. Unity, after they voted to overturn a free and fair election in the United States of America, but also preaching unity and not acknowledging that for 4 years, many of them gave oxygen to Donald Trump's conspiracy theories, to the big lies. They turned the other way in the face of racism and bigotry and how he embraced some of the most intolerant voices in this country. They just let it go. You know, I will remind everybody here that words have consequences. And ignoring words that are wrong also have consequences. You know, what happened would never have happened if everybody stood up in unity and called out the president when he was not telling the American people the truth, when he was pushing a big lie. We will never have unity without truth and also without accountability. This week in Congress, we saw the best of us and the worst of us. Some of my colleagues have shown that they will defend this president no matter what he does. There's nothing that he could do that would dissuade them from all-out support. But some are standing up and doing the right thing under tremendous pressure, and I am proud of that, and I honor them for their courage. This impeachment resolution outlines the truth of what Trump did. It is time that this Congress now holds him accountable for his words and for their devastating impact. Last week, we took an oath to protect this nation. As history calls on us today, I pray that we all have the moral clarity to uphold it here today. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The question is on order in the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, on that, I would request the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device.
The House of Representatives is now voting on the rule that puts parameters on today's debate. Now, after this vote, the House will debate the articles of impeachment, and a vote on that is expected later this afternoon. I'm Libby Casey, and this is live coverage from the Washington Post. With me now, Capitol Hill reporter Rhonda Colvin and White House reporter Tolu Olorunipa. Thank you to both of you. So, Rhonda, this is moving awfully fast for what is a deliberative institution. Let's talk about how they're able to do this fairly quickly.
That's right, and I'm thankful that you did lay that out, that what we just witnessed is not the actual vote for impeachment. That is just to set up the rules so they can debate on the article of impeachment. So this is sort of that pregame moment where we heard from several different members from both sides of the aisle. And this is what will carry us into the rest of the day, the rest of the afternoon, when you will see more members come to the floor and debate. So this is just kind of teeing up for the actual debate on the articles of impeachment. And I think what we just witnessed is important because it's showing us what both sides are thinking. We heard some of the same refrains from Republicans who said this is a rushed process, this didn't go through the actual steps. And I think it's important to note that the Constitution doesn't exactly give, play-by-play, step 1, step 2, step 3 on how an impeachment should be carried out. So usually when we see an impeachment, although we don't see them often, they are carried out in a very long and deliberate fashion. But right now, because of the moment, because of what happened last week, Democrats say that if we don't do this now, this is what we all witnessed on the 6th is all the reason in the world to make sure that Donald Trump leaves office and also isn't able to run again for the presidency, which is something that he has said. So that was the main argument from the Democrats that we heard. I think the ones that stood out to me, we heard from Representative Mace, who's a Republican. She's a new member from South Carolina. She talked about how she made her kids and family go home before all of this happened, a few days before it happened, because she had heard reports that a mob would be coming to D.C., and she's glad she made that decision. But she also said this is rushed, and it did not go through the usual process. She mentioned that it bypassed the Judiciary Committee. I just want to note that it did go to members of the Judiciary Committee. They did create a staff report from the majority to craft these articles. So it did go through, in a sense, the Judiciary Committee. But yes, it is on a fast track, and the reason why is because Democrats say you can't wait a second longer. You don't know what could happen between now and Wednesday.
Rhonda, I want to stay with you just for one more moment to talk about some of the arguments that Republicans are giving. As you mentioned, Congresswoman Mace was concerned about the rapidity of the process as well as the way it's going. But it's astounding because a couple of Republicans referred to the last impeachment of President Trump and were saying things like, Congressman Reschenthaler was like, at least that one had research and reports and experts and Republicans at the time, of course, were hardly holding up the last impeachment as a paradigm of process. I'm interested in process because, especially in the Senate, during the last impeachment, Republican senators said, I'm not voting to impeach the president because I don't like how this process went. And they used the process as their excuse not to convict the president. So I want to hear more from you on how Republicans are mounting their counter arguments here. Are they focused on the process? Are they focused on the severity of impeachment? Are they focused on unity? What are the threads you're hearing?
Yeah, and that's a good point too, that back then, last year, it was about the process. And now it's, they are claiming that there's lack of a process. So, you're thinking, which one is it? I just think this all speaks to how many of these members are feeling about that moment last week, how they witnessed it, their families witnessed it, how they were there, right there, and their personal safety was in jeopardy. I think that they're all still working through all of that and trying to match their arguments to what everyone saw. Back then, the last impeachment, public opinion was sort of, 50-50, where some Americans, half of Americans felt that Donald Trump should be impeached, others didn't. And I know Democrats spent a lot of time trying to appeal and get a heightened public opinion on their side. This time is a little different because all of America, all of the world, frankly, saw what happened. And that's what's adding to the immediacy of this. That's why people at home are in agreement with many Democrats who are saying we need to act now and we don't need to prolong this. So they have that public opinion on their side. It's growing, and that's also removing the argument from Republicans who say this is rushed, because a lot of Americans are saying this puts us in jeopardy domestically as well as on the world stage, because our enemies are looking at this and seeing that it seemed to be easy for the capital of the United States to be overtaken. So all of that is playing into this argument that the Republicans are trying to put forward. But that argument seems to be losing weight when you do think about Americans who are saying this impeachment is something that they can get behind being a little expedited.
Let's go to Tolu Olorunipa to get the White House perspective on this. Tolu, what is happening at the White House this week? How checked in is President Trump to this process, and who is still with him and advising him at this moment?
Yeah, Olivia, it's a skeleton crew that is still at the White House. We have seen a large number of people departing, some publicly, some silently, leaving their role at the White House to seek other opportunities, handing in their resignation letters. And now it's really just the president's closest advisors. Even a few members of his family are close to him and advising him. We saw him for the first time yesterday since this riot took place on the grounds of the Capitol. And the president was not apologetic. He was not remorseful. He essentially was still defiant, and he essentially said that, that his supporters were, aggrieved because of this idea that the election was stolen, and he gave a nod to the idea that there should be peace and that people should not be violent. He said that we are, my movement, the MAGA movement, is about supporting law enforcement. It's about peacefulness, but at the same time, he said that his supporters and himself have been, seized upon and have been attacked. Not only when it comes to being silenced on social media, but also through this impeachment process, which he called another extension of the witch hunt. He said that is something that's causing great pain to this country, and it's not something that should be happening during a time that he said was a very sensitive time for the country. So the president is watching these proceedings. He's watching to see what kind of grip he continues to have on the Republican Party. We have seen some high-ranking Republicans leave his side and essentially say that he is no longer fit for office, say that he should be impeached, or that he should resign. So he's watching to see what kind of sway he continues to hold over the party, how many of these Republicans in the House will stay with him, how many will break ranks. I think the number of people who are likely to break ranks is smaller than maybe previously expected, based on some of the names that came out earlier, people like Representative Liz Cheney, a high-ranking Republican, the number 3 Republican in the House, who said that the president should be impeached. There was some thought that may lead to sort of the dam breaking and multiple more Republicans coming out. So far, it seems from these conversations that we're seeing on the floor of the House that there are people that are still willing to defend the president, or at least say that he should not be impeached, continue to attack Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, Tolu, it's interesting to hear, as you bring that up, we wondered, as you said, if this dam would break. When Liz Cheney came out and when the reporting initially from the New York Times last night indicated that Leader McConnell was, open to impeachment, which is pretty shocking considering the fact that he's the top Republican besides the president, of the party. But this morning we did hear people like Congresswoman Mace, as Rhonda pointed out, saying she does hold the president responsible, and yet she will not vote to impeach. So we have been wondering if how Republicans would come out. Now, we're only getting an early indication because we've only heard a handful of members speak so far. But were you watching closely to see if that dam would break and to see if there would be an outpouring of GOP calls for impeachment?
I was watching very closely because it's been so difficult for any Republican to step outside of the president's orbit, to go across from where he is on any particular issue over the past 4 years. That's really been sort of like a death sentence for any of these Republicans deciding to cross this president. So the fact that some did openly, publicly, not anonymously, not behind the scenes, not hiding their names, but some put their names to statements saying that the president should be impeached, saying that they were condemning his actions, saying that he's unfit for office. That is something that we haven't seen very much of over the past 4 years. And I was wondering whether or not that was something that other Republicans were just waiting to do, waiting to see if the coast would be clear, if they saw other people within their party, other high-ranking officials take that step, and whether or not that would open the floodgates so that some of these other Republicans who behind the scenes do say things like the president is unfit for office, the president is not, upholding the constitutional role that he should be upholding, but they're unwilling to say that publicly because we have seen, people who have gotten crosswise with the president, be the victim of nasty tweets and see their political careers upended. And all of these, politicians are very ambitious, and they do want to have a future in the Republican Party, and they want to have a future in politics. And what we've seen over the past 4 years is that Republicans that do not get the support of the president, Republicans who are willing to publicly chastise the president, quickly find themselves either leaving the party or leaving politics, retiring, or getting primaried and losing their seats. And there are a number of Republicans that continue to fear President Trump and his base, and they don't want to get on the wrong side of an issue. So
let's
I
talk
was
about
waiting
that
to
for a
see.
moment. Yeah, let's talk about that and go deeper, because there's this, Twitter was really the mechanism by which President Trump was able to sort of immediately condemn someone to Lou if they were countering him. And he doesn't have that platform anymore. He no longer has the social media, megaphone. However, he is still, of course, the president. He's got a phone, he's got a briefing room, he's got a podium, he can make speeches and talk about things whenever he wants. I do want to turn this to Rhonda Colvin to get a sense from her of this question of the threat and fear that the president can still wield against members of his own party. Rhonda?
It's very real, and I would argue that that is top of mind for many of them. I think, of course, politics plays into this. They want to figure out, what other members of the caucus are doing. They're also calculating how their constituents are going to take however they vote. But I would say, yes, it is a real threat for some of these folks if they go up against the president and vote for impeachment. And I think they're thinking about that. I think the events of last Wednesday to them are proof that if he mentions you by name, you may have some physical danger there. Think about on Friday, Lindsey Graham went to the D.C. airport, and there has been video of a small mob circling him as he's trying to get to his gate. And it looked pretty tense there. And so other members, too, have been heckled on their flights. Their offices are getting calls in saying, death threats or just even vague mentions of danger that might be coming their way if they vote for impeachment. So there is a human angle to their decision making. Usually it's all political, but right now they know the president can put something out there, and yes, he may not be able to use Twitter, but he can use other ways and devices to get his messages out, and it's a real fear among Republicans what to do next.
So, Rhonda, I want to remind our viewers, if they're just tuning in, what they're watching. So we're seeing these groups of votes. If you see a member of Congress, like right now, standing up, it's because they are putting in a vote for a colleague, a proxy vote. So you're not missing any of the speeches and conversation and debate going on the floor. And Rhonda, this is all the buildup. This is just getting through a lot of the procedural steps until we get to the vote later on this afternoon, yes?
That is correct. You have not, if you're watching with us, you have not missed anything, or you're looking at that vote tally right there. That is not the impeachment vote at all. We are just in the procedural first steps of bringing the article of impeachment to the floor. So this is always, I think it's an interesting step to watch, because you are able to see some of the early arguments that members are going to make for or against impeachment. And it's also important to note that, yes, they are voting by proxy, some of them, because traffic on the House floor is limited because of the coronavirus. We also need to remember we are still amid a pandemic, and the House back over the summer changed their rules in order to allow members to send a representative to vote for them on the floor so that they can reduce that traffic. So yeah, that's important to note, that this vote is also very different from last year's, because the House chamber was full when we started hearing debates for impeachment. Right now, of course, that's not the same because of the pandemic.
Well, we have some more breaking news to report this morning. The mayor of New York had said today that the city is canceling contracts with Trump's businesses because of the Capitol riot. The contracts Trump has with the city are for ice skating rinks, the Central Park, Carousel, and a Trump golf property in the Bronx, Toulouse. How impactful is this to Donald Trump's future?
Well, President Trump was a New Yorker when he became president. He's now become a Floridian. He's decided to leave New York, but this is emblematic of what we have been seeing over the past several days with various corporate entities, cities, institutions trying to sever ties with anything that has to do with President Trump. We started to see this during the campaign. He had a clothing line running out of Macy's that, as soon as the president started his campaign with very incendiary rhetoric, some people would say racist rhetoric about immigrants, Macy's cut ties with President Trump. And we did see President Trump really try to court some of these corporate entities. And, after he became president, a lot of these institutions did work with his administration, did support him on tax cuts and all of the various economic policies that he was putting into place. But I think this riot that we saw just last week was a bridge too far for a number of these institutions and corporations, and they're slowly, one by one, starting to cut ties with him. New York is a place that President Trump already has felt it was unwelcoming for him, and he decided to change his residency. But this is one other instance in which New York is sort of not being proud to have a president from New York City in the White House. Instead, it's publicly trying to sever ties with anything having to do with the president, including the business relationship that goes back several decades between the Trump Organization and New York City, Central Park, the ice rink. This was a big part of President Trump's story of sort of being someone who can turn things around and fix things that other people hadn't, with the woman rigged there. But this is.
Tulu, what you're saying is so important, and I want to just pause for a moment to emphasize that. If you think back to the 80s and the 90s, this was President Trump's brand, right? That's how he became Donald Trump, the famous guy. We think about The Apprentice, but even before The Apprentice, the things that New York City is able to take away from him now were part of how Donald Trump built his brand and got a national profile to the point where, he was the walk-on character in a movie that just needed to show a really rich, wealthy, successful guy, right? So this is all part of how he has gotten to be the person he is in the American consciousness. So is this about a wallet hit, or is this about, a reputation hit when you see some of these, direct economic impacts and fallouts from what's happened?
Well, there definitely will be an economic impact from this, but I do think, as you mentioned, it's much more about President's reputation, how he's going to be remembered, how he is going to go down in history. And, it's going to be much different from what you mentioned, sort of the brash billionaire, image that he cultivated over recent decades before running for office. Instead, it's going to be, his presidency that's going to define much of his image, much of how he's remembered. And it's going to be these final days of his presidency, which were marred by great conflict and, in the eyes of many, an assault on democracy. The president sort of trying to undermine the American democratic system in multiple different ways, including by inciting this violent riot that led to, 5 people dying right in the middle of Washington, D.C. at the halls of power. So this is something that, for President Trump, who's very big on branding, very big on imagery, this is an image that's going to stick with him. He may like the fact that he has been able to have supporters who are willing to die for him or willing to, storm the Capitol for him. But, the fact that all of these various institutions are severing ties with him means that he's going to have a much more isolated image. He's going to be popular with a sliver of the country, but there are increasing numbers of people that want to have nothing to do with him. And that's going to be hard for him in his post-presidency when he does not have the power that he has as president. There are going to be multiple people that are not going to want him to be involved in anything having to do with their institution or their organization or their corporation. And that is that's unlike anything we've heard from a past president or former president.
Remarkable. Let's bring James Hohmann into the conversation. James, the Daily 202 talks this morning, as I've been able to skim it before coming on air just now, about these Republicans who have said they will vote to impeach the president. So what are you hearing about their reasoning? And, they're only a handful so far, right? We wondered if there would be more, but so far it's just a handful.
Yeah, Libby, and the White House expects there to be more, so do Republican leaders. But right now, only 5 have come out on the record. And their reasons are different. But essentially, they all boil down to Trump was responsible for inciting this mob that attacked the Capitol. Trump has not shown true contrition. Fred Upton, the Republican from Michigan, who used to be the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, said in his statement, I watched the president's speech in Texas yesterday. He clearly doesn't feel bad at all about what happened or his role in it, which is, the first step to being able to accept and move on. And then, Liz Cheney went the farthest. The daughter of the former vice president, the number 3 in Republican leadership, she said this is the worst violation of a president's oath in American history, which is a pretty dramatic thing to say. Trump, in his speech on the ellipse right before he kind of encouraged everyone to go over to the Capitol, had attacked her by name and said, we need to get rid of the Liz Cheneys of the Republican Party. I think that there's a lot of people, especially on the Senate side, Mitch McConnell, who see an opportunity not just to, as Tolu was just explaining, sideline Trump, but also to take the kind of the punch out of Trumpism. I think that they see this opportunity with Trump at his nadir. A Quinnipiac poll yesterday showed his approval rating had fallen down to 33%. Most Republicans still with the president, but I think that there is a lot of concern among the establishment old guard in the party that Trump, even if he doesn't run again in 2024, is going to spend the next 3 or 4 years flirting with the idea that he may get into the race, either in the primaries or the general election. And one of the attractions of impeaching him, especially for McConnell and Cheney, is that Trump wouldn't be able to run again if he's removed from office or if he's impeached after he leaves office, or convicted, I guess I should say, by the Senate, and that would really make a huge difference in the party. Of course, people would try to carry the Trump banner in future elections, people like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, who voted to overturn the election results last week. But ultimately, if Trump himself is out of the picture, so much of what Trumpism is really a cult of personality. It's so much about Donald Trump himself. A lot of times there's not really ideological coherence to it. So I think Cheney, McConnell, and some other members who are thinking about voting for impeachment today see this opportunity to declare that this is not what the future of the Republican Party should be about.
Tolu Olorunnipa, let's get you in one last time before we let you go. What are you going to be watching for and listening for today, through your lens of a White House reporter, as you think about how this really relates to Trump's next decisions, his next comments, his next moves? What are you listening for?
Yeah, the president has just about over a week left in office, and I want to listen to how he responds to what's happening on the House floor, how much power he has over his party, whether he's on the phone with some of these lawmakers, and that'll give us a sense of what kind of role he might play in our political system, in the Republican Party, after he leaves office, whether or not he's able to exert influence, able to exert power over a party that he essentially hijacked 5 years ago and took over, and whether or not he could do that, or whether or not some of the people who are trying to take back control of the party, including folks like Senator Mitch McConnell, who saw his Senate majority evaporate under Trump and saw the House majority also get lost under Trump, whether or not they realize that Trumpism is not a winning formula when it comes to winning congressional elections, and they may need to shift away from Trumpism. So I'll be watching that very closely. We've heard that Mitch McConnell is not happy with President Trump, that he does not want to speak with him. Whether or not that relationship continues to be sour for the next 7 days, and whether or not President Trump decides to do things that he had been holding back on over the course of his presidency, now that he only has a week left, whether it's pardoning himself, using the powers of the presidency against its enemies, launching any kind of foreign intervention or foreign attack to seal his legacy. There's a lot that can happen in a week, and I'll be watching very closely to see how this impeachment process impacts the president and impacts how he decides to spend his final days in office.
All right, Tolu Olorunnipa, thank you so much. Let's go live now to Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, who's giving a briefing. We're continuing to monitor, of course, the House floor, and we'll head back there when action commences. But for now, here's the D.C. Mayor.
Will be, as all special security events are, led by the United States Secret Service. And as we will, you also recall that I asked the Acting Attorney General to direct the FBI to provide an intelligence and threat briefing on a daily basis throughout the special security event time period, which is ongoing. And I also requested that the Secretary of the Department of the Interior cancel any and all public gathering permits in the District of Columbia and deny any future applications during the special event period. Those discussions we continue with the Department of the Interior. On Monday, I also extended the pause that we announced just before the Christmas holiday, or I called it the holiday pause, and this will extend through the inaugural period. So certain phase 2 activities related to our COVID response remain paused through Friday, January 22nd at 5 a.m. And during this time, we are asking residents to avoid our central business district and only travel to the central business district if you have essential business. Yesterday, if you were downtown or around the Capitol, you likely noticed the additional preparations which have begun. And that includes around the inauguration perimeter, the White House, the mall, the Capitol, and other key parts of downtown. Individuals entering the perimeter may be subject to screening and asked to describe their essential business, so be prepared to do that. We also want to amplify this information that we received from the Secret Service beginning 6 a.m. on Friday the 15th. All parking garages in the restricted zones will be blocked off. Any vehicles still in the garage or loading zone at 6 a.m. Friday must be remain there until after the inauguration. So plan to move your vehicles. Businesses that need to receive deliveries will be advised of an off-site screening facility. Further, residents and businesses between 19th to 14th Streets Northwest and K Street to Constitution Avenue are already being advised of these restrictions. So more information about additional closures will be forthcoming. While we know this is very inconvenient for our residents and businesses, I want to say thank you for your cooperation and flexibility. Clearly, we are in uncharted waters, and it is very important that we work with all of our partners to secure these events and secure these parts of our city. Certainly this time last year, we didn't expect to be in this situation. Even last week, we didn't expect to be starting this early. So we want to advise neighbors to please follow for updates. And information can change, so it's important to have these updates. So text INAUG 2021, INAUG 2021 to 888-777 to get the latest updates from DC government. Further, as
you're watching live coverage in the Washington Post, that's the D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser addressing what's happening in Washington, D.C. in preparation for this weekend and the inauguration. I mean, Rhonda, it is a bit shocking to be a resident of Washington, D.C. right now and see all of the barricades going up, see National Guard troops all over town. You know, in a way, it is a reminder how unprepared the Capitol was last week for what took place in terms of where the barricades were set up, where barriers and lines were placed, as well as what sort of law enforcement footprint was there. And yet it's still very jarring right now as a resident of Washington to try to figure out how to even navigate the city with so much intense security happening.
That's so true. My commute into our studio here in the office usually is not very long, but I had to take all sorts of detours because there is a larger police presence all around DC. It's not just Capitol Hill, it's pretty much the entire downtown surrounding area. And it just goes to show you how all law enforcement agencies are trying to scramble, trying to protect this area, not only from what might happen on the inauguration, you know, God forbid anything to happen, but they're also protecting for over this weekend when there are intelligence reports saying that there could be some sort of insurrections or mob activity in DC as well as 50 state capitals. So I think all cities and states are looking at their security measures and trying to tighten up, and that is one thing that last Wednesday certainly accomplished was on Capitol Capitol Hill, trying to get more security there, more security for members, more security for people who have to go in every day, and just, you know, have a heavier security footprint. And I was there the day after Wednesday, on Thursday, and speaking to a representative who told me she just wanted everyone to realize that we can't let this one go, that there have been many times, especially in the last 4 years, where we have had some troubling events or heard of things that have been troubling and kind of let it go and moved on to the next news story. But this one should stick, and it should stick here in D.C. To make sure that the Capitol and other agencies as well are secure. You know, it's national security. It's a question of national security. It's a question of how our adversaries see us as well. And it also can bring confidence to our allies to see that we are secure, we are up and running properly.
Well, so many questions remain about the attack on the Capitol 1 week ago. Who were the people who broke into the building, and what happens to them now? National video reporter Hannah Jewell joins us right now with more. Hannah?
Hi, Libby. So, yes, we know that the Democrats are charging the president with inciting violence against the United States today. But there will be hundreds of charges stemming from the violence last week for the many, many people who arrived in that mob to Washington. So, as Americans, we like to think that we have unlimited powers of free speech under the First Amendment. But this isn't true of the president or of the pro-Trump protesters and rioters. Really not full freedom. There are limits to even that freedom that we hold so dearly, right? So the question is, where is the legal line drawn between a protester's protected free speech activity and criminal behavior? Basically, who conducted themselves lawfully on January 6th and who did not? Well, over the last week, the Washington Post has been reporting on who these people are that stormed the Capitol and what they may be charged with now. There were thousands of people who came into Washington from at least 36 states last week, and they reflected the many types of people who make up President Trump's base. Some were working class laborers, and some flew in on private jets. Some were members of white supremacist groups, and some were professionals who spend, you know, a lot of time on Facebook arguing with their friends and neighbors about the election. Some were adherents to the QAnon conspiracy, which alleges, falsely I shouldn't have to say, but feel like I do, that the conspiracy which alleges that Democrats and the media are running a child abuse ring. And some of these mob were neo-Nazis, and some were a lot of the above, right? These beliefs have started to merge, and you saw them really coalesce on that day. Some of these protesters and rioters were lawyers, some were active, retired law enforcement, some were veterans of the armed forces. There were hairstylists, there were construction workers, lawyers, real estate agents. There was even, Libby, an Olympic gold medalist, a swimmer called Cleet Keller, who may now face federal charges for his activities on January 6th. So the only thing many of them had in common was that they were mostly white and mostly men. They were there to protest also what they falsely believed was a stolen election, and they feared a Joe Biden presidency would bring about socialism and more stringent lockdowns and mask mandates to contain the pandemic, right? And now many have spent the last week trying to delete their social media profiles where they recorded their intentions to storm the Capitol or even broadcasting themselves doing it. But Libby, it doesn't work that way, right? The internet is written in ink, as the line goes from the movie The Social Network. So as the Post has reported, many of this mob have already been arrested on charges ranging from breaking curfew because the mayor of DC had instituted a 6 p.m. curfew that night, to unlawful entry, to more serious charges like firearms possession, assault, violent entry, disorderly conduct, and there are likely to be hundreds of people charged with various crimes in the wake of the Capitol attack. In fact, the Department of Justice has just announced a website which they say will be continuously updated with this wide range of charges. But perhaps the most serious charge that protesters could face is seditious conspiracy, which means a conspiracy to overthrow, put down, or destroy the government by force. This is a federal crime defined by 2 or more people who use force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the U.S. or by force seize, take, or possess any property of the U.S. So rioters certainly succeeded, Libby, in delaying the certification of the Electoral College that day. But anyway, seditious conspiracy can be a very difficult charge to prove, and it's rarely used successfully. It carries a maximum possible prison sentence of 20 years. And it's a very high bar when other charges might be a lot easier to prove, especially as rioters have provided, as I said, so much evidence online of their own potentially criminal activities. Also, of course, whoever planted pipe bombs outside the Democratic and Republican National Committee offices may even face terrorism charges. So while the House decides today what consequences the president may or may not face, the consequences are already raining down on the people who stormed on the Capitol. Libby?
Hannah Jewell, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I want to turn to James Homan for some follow-up on what Hannah had to share with us, because, as Hannah points out, this charge of sedition and conspiracy is very weighted. And when we heard representatives of the FBI and Justice yesterday say that they are looking at that, it spoke a lot. Now, they said, look, we're getting people on trespassing and some other things, but that's just the beginning, right? That may be the beginning of the charges even those individuals face. So we go into today's impeachment process, James, with these incredibly serious potential charges and allegations hanging over the people who came into the Capitol. How does that play into the minds of members of Congress today?
It plays into the minds very significantly, Libby, because this is so top of mind for them. And, one of the big questions, and Hannah's update was great because it does capture the wide range of charges available. For seditious conspiracy, you have to prove conspiracy. So one of the key elements is who knew what, when. Trump said it was going to be wild, it was going to be quite a show. Did people in Trump's orbit know in advance what some people were planning? There are a lot of Democratic members. One woman from New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill, last night during a virtual town hall with her constituents suggested that some of her Republican colleagues may have been giving reconnaissance tours to some of the people who would come back the next day as part of the mob. She did not name names. If that's true, and that was kind of a known thing that they knew these people were going to be coming back to the Capitol, or if someone turned over blueprints, some of the things that were found online showed tunnels, the tunnels under the Capitol. Somehow the mob found out the exact location of the Senate Parliamentarian's office. Jim Clyburn, the number 3 in Democratic leadership, said that they found where his private hideaway is, his private office that's not marked. So there's a very good question that the feds are going to have to try to explore, which is how did the people, the rioters, get this information? Who gave it to them? And there's a lot of different legal standards, and these can be tough cases to prove. But one of the things that was most striking about that news conference yesterday with the prosecutors was that they said we're going to be shocked by some of the information that's still going to come out. And so not just the number of people that could still face charges, but I think it hangs over a lot of this debate is whether there were people inside the Capitol who were aware of this, who were somehow participating. There's no proof, but that, I think, terrifies a lot of Democrats who right now really just don't feel safe at work. So that is going to end up being a key thing in the prosecutions, but it's also going to be key as this floor debate continues the afternoon.
And I want to remind you, if you're just tuning in or you're wondering what is happening on the House floor right now, this is procedural, and if you see members of Congress standing up to talk, it's because they're helping their colleagues vote by proxy. So right now, this is the initial steps that have to take place before they open up for debate on the actual article of impeachment. We'll be watching that all unfold today, as well as the ultimate vote on this article of impeachment. James brought up a moment ago claims by Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill that were alarming. I want to look at this startling claim from her last night. This is from Facebook Live, and she says she witnessed Republican colleagues giving reconnaissance tours of the Capitol the day before the attack.
We can't have a democracy if members of Congress are actively helping the president overturn the election results. And so not only do I intend to see that the president is removed and never runs for office again and doesn't have access to classified material, I also intend to see that those members of Congress who embedded him, those members of Congress who had groups coming through the Capitol that I saw on January 5th, a reconnaissance for the next day. Those members of Congress that incited this violent crowd. Those members of Congress that attempted to help our president undermine our democracy. I'm going to see that they're held accountable, and if necessary, ensure that they don't serve in Congress.
Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill, a Democrat. Rhonda Colvin, how does what we're hearing from her and other Democratic members of the aisle, how does that square with the call we heard from Republicans today to establish a sort of 9/11 commission to look into what happened? Tell us what Republicans were asking for today and how that would, relate to the proceedings.
Well, the Republicans' call to set up an investigation or a commission like the 9/11 Commission seemed a little bit more political. It's sort of a way to deflect from impeaching the president. They're saying they agree that these activities were alarming, and the way we need to approach this whole situation is not impeach the president, but look into any failures. Now, that certainly is something that Democrats have also said too, but for Republicans, that's really their one thing that they want out of all of this. They don't want to impeach the president, they just want to go into this commission situation. But what she said there is something that a lot of members are saying, not so much Republicans publicly at least, but a lot of members are saying that there were probably some alarming things that happened before the events took place, and there seems to be sort of a story crafting up that shows that there might be evidence that this mob was helped in some way to navigate the Capitol. So I think that is something that will be investigated. I think Democrats do plan to do some sort of investigation, but their issue one right now is that President Trump, they feel, is a danger to be in office any longer, and the danger to even, return to run for president in 2024. So they're trying to focus on that. That's the main focus for them today. And then later on, we'll craft some sort of investigative arm to look into these things. Because I know what the representative in the clip was saying. I started thinking back to last Wednesday, and when we were in that room in the basement waiting for this all to be over, I remember having conversations with my colleague Lindsay and saying, the Capitol is a labyrinth. It is not easy to figure out how to get from one place to the other. I mean, I've seen veteran reporters have to ask for directions. I have asked for directions. And many of the places that they infiltrated and got to, seemingly easy, seem to show that there was some forethought or at least discussion had to get to those places.
Rhonda, that's such a great point, what a labyrinth the Capitol is. And just a reminder, if our viewers weren't watching last week, you and our colleague Lindsay Sitz were forced to flee from the Cannon Rotunda. You were told to seek shelter. I mean, can you just remind us what the experience was like as someone who was in the Capitol complex last week?
Yeah, we were there to cover the January 6th process of certifying the win for Biden, and we were there that morning doing our pre-show, and shortly after the first objection, when the Electoral College vote tally for Arizona was announced and that was objected to, and the joint session broke up, we heard a Capitol officer come through the media area in Cannon and tell us to evacuate now, evacuate now. So we went to the basement area of that building and near some of the tunnels that can take you to the Capitol, and we stayed there for about an hour. It was rather long, just trying to figure out what happened or what was happening. And shortly after then, we talked to some officers, asking them where should we go to be safe. And at that point, we heard on one of the officers' radio that shots had been fired on the House floor. So at that point, he said immediately, get somewhere in a room that locks. We tested a few rooms out and found a basement mechanical room that was sort of an electrical hub for that part of the Capitol complex. So we stayed there, barricaded the door until we got that all clear to get out of there. And then it was a few more hours till we could actually leave the area because the Capitol was on lockdown until a sweep occurred. So we left, that whole day for us ended around 8 o'clock when we were able to get out of there. Of course, we finished the show because both the House and Senate went back to the business of the day, which was certifying that Electoral College vote for Biden.
When you say you finished the show, you came back on air with us despite having gone through that horrible experience, kept explaining to our viewers and to us what was going on, returning just like the members of Congress elected to do. I want to turn to James. You know, this delay in response that Rhonda experienced, and other colleagues in journalism experienced, staffers on Capitol Hill experienced, and also members of Congress and the Vice President of the United States were trapped in that complex, waiting for law enforcement help. How is Congress reckoning with or dealing with the delay in the president both calling on his supporters to stand down, and also the delay in getting law enforcement back up on the scene? I mean, it's interesting that the articles of impeachment, are really focused on President Trump's role in inciting the mob, but there's also a really important question about his role that the Washington Post and others are digging into in the immediate aftermath of the attack. Was he helping or hindering the process?
Hindering.
Right.
And the reporting is incredible in the sense that it is much worse than we realized when we were all together 1 week ago at this hour. And the president, was watching it, relishing it on television. Leaders were calling him, trying to get help. He wouldn't take the calls. Finally Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, the Republican leader, got a hold of him. He felt like Trump wasn't really paying attention, so he called into Fox News because he knew the president was watching Fox and he wanted to get the president's attention on Fox. One of the things I think that is so important to understand about why they're moving so quickly on impeachment, why they're doing this just a week before the president leaves office, is these members of Congress are among the most powerful people in the world, Libby. And last Wednesday, for several hours, it took 6 hours from when the Capitol was breached until it was secured again. These folks felt powerless. One of our colleagues, Paul Kane, was in one of the safe rooms with a bunch of senators, and one of the senators' phones ran out of power, and he had to ask Paul if he could borrow his charger. And when Paul was relating that in a politics team conference call the other day, it occurred to me that was really a metaphor for how powerless these powerful people felt. We obviously heard a few hours ago the video from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was concerned she wouldn't make it through the day alive. But Nancy Pelosi is calling Ralph Northam, the governor of Virginia, on his cell phone, asking him to send Virginia troops because the White House isn't sending help. Steny Hoyer, her number 2 in Democratic leadership, called the cell phone of the governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, a Republican, pleading with him to send troops. Larry Hogan telling him he didn't have clearance. He was in the room. Hoyer and Pelosi were in the same safe room as Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate. And Schumer walks over to the phone, and he's kind of talking strongly into the phone to Hogan. This is your authorization. Send in the Maryland National Guard. And it taking still more than 90 minutes for the Pentagon to give the okay for Maryland to start sending troops. So I think there's hundreds of stories like that. I've now talked to so many members, including allies of the president, who all have horror stories about how scary it was, about having their staff barricade themselves in offices and hide under conference tables while people shouted their member's name outside, vandalism. So I think that is really why you have a lot of Republicans who would be certainly willing to censure the president, if not impeach him, because these powerful people felt just so powerless.
I want to share some breaking news from our colleague, Mike DeBonis. Rhonda, let's kick this to you first of all. Mike DeBonis is sharing that Jim Jordan says Liz Cheney should be removed as conference chair, removed from that leadership position among the House GOP. So raising that as a conversation point.
Yeah, that's not altogether surprising. Jim Jordan, for those who don't know or don't remember his role in the last impeachment, he is a very, very energetic and staunch ally of the president. And for him to react that way, that almost seems like he's also telegraphing some of the comments that Trump has said about Representative Cheney. This shows also that there are going to be some divisions, continued divisions out of the Republican caucus there in the House after this is all over. I mean, the vote will eventually happen one way or the other later today, but they, as a caucus in the House, are experiencing a lot of contention, a lot of finger pointing as well too, because you do have even though some members have not come out publicly on not wanting Trump to continue as president, you can believe that they are having conversations, maybe more pointed conversations behind the scenes as a caucus, about how they feel about the president and the situation they feel he may have put them in last week. So it's not altogether surprising, given that you said it's from Jim Jordan, but it does highlight that we're already seeing some of the aftermath of this impeachment vote is going to be that the Republican caucus in the House is divided.
James, let's get your reaction to that.
The key things for Liz Cheney is that it's a secret ballot. So they can force another vote on whether to keep her as conference chair. And she could lose that vote. I mean, she took a big political risk. Only a new CBS YouGov poll that came out this morning showed only 15% of Republicans want to remove Trump from office during his final week. So she could lose that vote, but it is a secret ballot. Jim Jordan.
To be clear, the secret ballot is when
you don't have to see who voted for who.
But we're talking about the conference leadership.
Exactly.
Deciding who your leaders are. We're not talking about the impeachment vote today. We're talking about as Republicans choose their leadership.
Exactly. So Republicans could have a meeting of just Republicans. It's a private meeting to vote on their leaders, basically a vote of no confidence on Liz Cheney. This isn't, on the floor. It's not public. It's just to decide who's going to be the leader for the Republicans. One of the things that is striking is, Jim Jordan has been kind of a dead ender for Trump. The president awarding him the Presidential Medal of Freedom this week, in a private ceremony. The Jordan has really carried water. One of the things a lot of people are watching Jordan for is whether or not he's going to launch a primary challenge as sort of the Trump candidate in 2022 in Ohio against Rob Portman, who voted to uphold the election results last week, and Jordan criticized him for that. So there's a lot of intrigue, and I think it is a reflection of no matter what happens to Liz Cheney or what happens on this vote, Republicans are going to be divided. When they really hope to win control of the House majority in 2022, you're going to have a lot of primaries. The president has said that he's going to go campaign for primary challengers against people like John Thune, the number 2 Senate Republican who's up for re-election in South Dakota. If Trump follows through on that, it will be a big test of how vibrant Trumpism will be when Trump's no longer in office, and how much his power will be diluted once he's out of the Oval.
Just to update everybody, we're still watching this vote here. This is a motion on ordering the previous question on the rule, and then we'll get to looking at the rules and a vote on that, and then ultimately we'll get to this debate on impeachment. Rhonda, you have to sort of love the grinding and nitty-gritty procedural steps that Congress takes. Most people want to know if it passed or didn't pass, is the president impeached or not? But here you got to actually see this deliberative body going through its procedural steps.
That's right. Nothing really happens very quickly. In fact, seeing what they've been able to do in the last 48 hours is, rapid for them. I mean, they usually don't move this fast on much. So that shows you the sense of urgency a lot of members of Congress are feeling right now, whether they're saying it publicly or not. They feel that this is an issue that they need to keep in the forefront. They know that we live in a world where, something next happens, in the next hour, and then we're focusing on that. But this is something that they don't want to let go. So that was one of the motivators to get this going. And you might remember Nancy Pelosi saying last week, shortly after the events of January 6th, saying her phone was ringing off the hook saying, impeach, impeach, impeach. And a lot of members are saying that they're hearing that, those calls internally as legislators, but also from constituents who want President Trump to be removed, even though we only have, a week before the next president comes in.
Rhonda, let's talk more about what's facing Speaker Pelosi in her decision-making process. She was on 60 Minutes on Sunday listing the choices that are before Congress and how to punish President Trump for his role in inciting the mob that stormed the Capitol. Let's watch.
What if he pardons himself? What if he pardons these people who are terrorists on the Capitol? Or pardons himself? What if he does that? He can only pardon himself from federal offenses. He cannot pardon himself from state offenses, and that's where he's being investigated in the state of New York. There is a possibility that after all of this, there's no punishment, no consequence,
and he could run again for president.
And that's one of the motivations that people have for advocating for impeachment.
Won't that take more than the 10 days? I mean, does it actually make sense?
Well, I like the 25th Amendment because it gets rid of him. He's out of office. But there is strong support in the Congress for impeaching the president a second time. This president is guilty of inciting insurrection. He has to pay a price for that.
That's House Speaker Nancy Pelosi on 60 Minutes. James, let's talk about the options that are really before members of both the House and Senate as they've been trying to figure out this week what to do, from censure to the 25th Amendment. People have been talking about the 14th Amendment, to this ultimate vote on impeachment.
Yeah, and it really is a reflection of just how angry liberals especially are that censure wasn't really an option on the table. I think there is a desire to be more punitive than that, more punitive than a slap on the wrist. If there would have been a simple censure resolution, I think you would have gotten a lot of Republicans to support it, and it could have moved quickly. But Democrats decided that that wasn't going to sort of placate their rank and file. So Pelosi, I think, is very eager, as she said, kind of straight up in that interview, to make sure that Trump can't run for office again. And you mentioned the 14th Amendment. One of the things that's been talked about a lot this week is that
we're just going to dip in and see what's happening in the House.
5, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the yeas have it. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Speaker, on that I would request the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device.
So you're seeing now voting again commence in the House. This is all procedural activity that's happening before that ultimate impeachment vote. We had the vote on the previous question. Now they're on agreeing to the resolution. So we'll watch this stay open for about 15 minutes or so longer. Sometimes when that counts down though on your screen, they still hold it open for a while. They are using a proxy voting process. Rhonda Colvin, let's go to you for a reminder that as we see members of the House stand up here, a lot of them are putting in the votes for their colleagues.
That's right. Back in the summer, I did some reporting on how this all works because Congress can't exactly work from home. The Senate has not decided to do any sort of proxy voting measures, but the House took some time to review their rules and see if it could work because they have so many members, 435 members who are coming from all sorts of parts of the country. They may have pre-existing conditions, or they have lived with family members who might be vulnerable to COVID. So the leadership in the House decided that they would create or enact a rule where members could send their vote to a colleague and have that colleague vote for them if they could not be present on the House floor. They've actually extended that vote by proxy for the next few months too, because the pandemic is still among us, and we're hearing reports that we're having record numbers of deaths and that this winter will be pretty serious. So that is another reason why this is taking so long. It's always a deliberative process, but one of the reasons why votes take so long right now is because there is limited traffic on the House floor and you have this vote by proxy effort.
Rhonda, there is some irony here, though, because House Republicans filed a lawsuit to block this proxy voting, and yet that's how they're doing it. They're engaging in the process. So,
yeah, there was a lot of pushback from Republicans when Democrats over the summer said they wanted to figure out how to vote by proxy to be safe. There were a lot of Republicans that said, well, if first responders can go to work, we as Congress members can go to work too. And, you know, that altogether is not a hard argument to make to many people. That's understandable. But when you are thinking about bringing people from all different cities and parts of the country who have to fly in and out of D.C. every week, some even do stay in their offices overnight too and shower in the gyms there. That's still a reality among House members mostly. The House the Democrats said we need to figure this out because this pandemic is serious, and we can't do our work without having remote opportunities. So there was a lot of back and forth on this vote by proxy rule that they went over the summer. It wasn't an easy thing for Democrats to enact. It took a lot of debate, a lot of talking, and getting their Republican colleagues on board. But you're right, they did push back against it.
So James, why are Republicans using vote by proxy right now if they were so against it?
Because it's a lot more convenient, and they need the votes. They need their members to be casting ballots, and it actually does make a lot of sense as a pandemic precaution. It reduces the number of people on the floor, and they lost their lawsuit. Ultimately, what the court said was the House has every right to make its own rules. It's not for the courts to decide.
So, James, let's talk about the metal detectors that have been placed outside of the chamber and the pushback it got from, aggressive pushback really, it got from some Republicans last night. So let's just talk about how we got there. Why are there metal detectors now? Why weren't they there before? And what was the reaction on both sides of the aisle?
Well, so the metal detectors were put in place unilaterally. It was by order of Nancy Pelosi. The Capitol Police put them in, these megtrometers. They're the kind of megtrometers you have to go through normally to get into the Capitol. There's a second layer to get on the floor. Part of it was driven by Madison Cawthorn, who's now the youngest member of the House in his mid-20s. He gave an interview to the local newspaper in his district where he said he actually was carrying a handgun surreptitiously in his wheelchair during the riot last week that he had brought with him on the floor. Lauren Boebert, who defeated a Republican congressman in a primary last year, Scott Tipton, a pretty conservative guy. She beat him from the right. She is from Rifle, Colorado, and she actually owns a gun-themed restaurant there. And so she's made a big deal about how she's going to carry her Glock on around the House and around the Congress. And then you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's the QAnon adherent from Georgia, also talking about the need to be able to carry weapons around. So all of that taken together has made people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Mondaire Jones, and other freshmen feeling really unsafe. And especially after last week, especially with concerns that some of their colleagues might have kind of offered tacit support to the mob. So that's why they put the metal detectors in place. Now, what happened was, people showed up for the vote and they flipped out. Members of Congress don't like hassles, but they also saw it as kind of this affront to their freedom and that they're somehow not trustworthy to come onto the floor. And so you had several members who flatly refused to go to the buy the metal detectors. These are Capitol Police officers who were literally saving their lives just a week ago. And they're just doing what they're instructed to do. It wasn't their decision to put up these magtrometers, but you had members storming past the mags onto the House floor. You had members refusing to go through them. You had people who, Lauren Boebert, the woman I mentioned from Colorado, her duffel bag that she was carrying with her set off the metal detector, and she refused to open it, refused to allow the officers to inspect it. Madison Cawthorn, similarly, for the guy from North Carolina, he wouldn't let himself be patted down. He said it was insulting.
So James, that's like you and me going through the airport.
Exactly.
And like not allowing TSA to search our belongings and then throwing a fit and storming onto the plane anyway.
And so
Which,
you kind
let's
of
just
understand
face
this
it,
is
we
all
wouldn't be allowed
deepening.
to. We wouldn't mean that, we wouldn't be allowed to do that.
Right. And so that is that whole spectacle. And a lot of people appropriately were kind of like, why are these Republican members more freaked out and angry and worked up about having to walk through a metal detector than they were about these officers who died last week? Why are they more worked up about this than Trump's comments inciting people to come to the mob, the mob to come to the Capitol? And so this is deepened tensions writ large between the two parties, and it shows just how tense this Congress is going to be. And a lot of the people who were refusing to go through the magtrometers are the very people who are using this talking point. It's time to unify. It's time to come together. We shouldn't be distracted by talking about what happened last week. And then, they're here throwing a fit about the metal detectors. So it is a reflection of just how kind of rotten the relationships have become where a lot of these members don't even treat their colleagues like human beings. Remember, this is also coming as 3 Democratic members of Congress have now tested positive for COVID, who were in rooms last week with Republicans who were refusing to wear masks even when they were being offered to them. Bonnie Watson Coleman, who's 75 years old, from New Jersey. She's a cancer survivor. She now has COVID. Brad Schneider from Illinois was stuck sitting around all these Republicans asking them to wear a mask. They said no. He'd been so careful. He represents a district in eastern Illinois. He'd been driving to and from the Capitol because he didn't think it was safe to fly on an airplane.
Wow.
And his wife has a serious medical condition, a pre-existing condition. So he'd been so careful, but he's sitting there for 5 hours with all these guys who weren't wearing masks, even when he asked them to. Now he's tested positive for COVID, and he's freaking out that his wife is going to get it too. So this is the kind of thing, I mean, when you just lay all this on top of each other, you can understand how just much, these both parties are frustrated with each other, but especially Democrats just feel like their Republican colleagues aren't even treating them with, the most basic decency called for by the golden rule.
James Hohmann, Rhonda Colvin, we're watching this procedural activity happen on the floor here as votes are taken in advance of the ultimate vote later on today, the vote on whether or not to impeach President Donald John Trump. This would be the second time he is impeached. Truly a historic moment and unprecedented. But Rhonda, as so many are saying, really on both sides of the aisle, this is an unprecedented moment because of the attack on the United States Capitol last week. Let's be clear, Rhonda, if you and I go into the Capitol, we have to go through a magnetometer, we have to put our belongings in a scanner. We're not allowed to bring guns, knives, pocket knives, rocket launchers, anything else inside the Capitol, which is one of the reasons why it was so horrifying last week to see people getting in without going through obviously any kind of security, because we didn't know what they were carrying. So what's unique in this moment is that members of Congress are being subjected to the same sort of treatment that everyone else is. They are usually able to move through the Capitol with ease, in part because they're in demand, they have to be places on time, and they do have that ability to sort of get special treatment because of their job. So this is a change for them. So we heard some upset because it was an inconvenience to have to wait in lines, but then we saw others making this sort of stand over, gun rights, et cetera.
That's right. Things are really tightening up there, and there's obviously support for things to be tightened up there, but you do have these criticisms. And as you mentioned, members are often able to get through very quickly or just wave through security, and while most have to go through a whole security line, take all of your belongings, and when you carry a lot of camera equipment, that can be quite tedious, but we do it because it's the United States Capitol, and we want to make sure people are safe. I know on Wednesday, while we were still in lockdown but could go up to the first floor of Rayburn and wait there until they opened the doors and gave the all clear, we were told to wear our badges everywhere, that everybody in that area, it didn't matter what you did for a living, you had to wear your badge so that the police could identify you as a person who should be in the Capitol, because you had so many people obviously who were not supposed to be there that day. So right immediately they started taking things a little bit more seriously. Of course, that's going to be tightened up, and it's probably also going to be a part of any investigation into Wednesday, is how did people get in from multiple points outside and get in. They weren't just coming through one door of the Capitol, they came through multiple points and easily, with some ease. So yeah, that is definitely going to be a part of any investigation to come.
Well, security has been increased since last Wednesday's brazen attack, and you can see striking images that show the United States Capitol being used as a barracks, essentially, for the first time since the Civil War. And yes, you can see there this tremendous show of force. I mean, James, these images are just stunning.
It really is, especially when you know the history of the Capitol. And, the last time the Capitol had been breached the way it was last week was when the British literally seized the building during the War of 1812 in 1814 when they sacked Washington. So much, it's kind of remarkable because a week ago the military was so worried about sending troops to the Capitol because they were concerned about the optics of having boots on the ground outside the Capitol in these kinds of images. But now I think for a lot of Americans, having these images is deeply reassuring. that these folks are there to keep us safe. The chairman, not just the chairman, all the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff put out a joint statement yesterday saying Biden is going to be the commander-in-chief next Wednesday, and criticizing what happened in the Capitol. The military is doing its part and is not party to what some scholars and experts like Fiona Hill are describing as an attempted coup by the president. So the military here keeping things under control, protecting the legislative prerogative. But there's so many pictures like this, and there was one picture I saw of a bunch of guys sleeping on the hard marble floors. Anyone who's been in the Capitol, Rhonda knows this so well, and so do you, of course, Libby. Those floors are so hard. Having to sleep, they don't have sleeping pads. It gets hard on the feet just to walk around on the marble floors all day. There was this group of guys, with their rifles, sleeping right outside of Nancy Pelosi's office, essentially as a barracks, but also protecting the speaker's office, the person who's second in line to the presidency. This is something we've never seen in our lifetimes, and frankly, hopefully, after next week, we'll never need to see again.
Rhonda, let's talk about some of the decisions that members of Congress are making today. Of course, they will be discussing shortly this afternoon the article of impeachment and whether or not President Trump should be impeached a second time. They're also sort of checking off on just who will manage this process, who would be the impeachment managers over in the Senate side as they go to a trial. So this is setting up, Rhonda, both the impeachment vote for later on today, but also what we expect to see really in the process ahead.
That's right. They're moving full steam ahead, even though we don't have any sort of date or knowledge of when a Senate trial could take place. And to let everyone at home know, the Senate is on a scheduled break this week, so there's no word yet on what they will do after the impeachment vote happens in the House. But yes, Nancy Pelosi announced yesterday the list of impeachment managers, and for those of you who watched our impeachment coverage a year ago this time, we watched as Adam Schiff lead the group of impeachment managers. Last time you had a really diverse group. I think the Speaker wanted to pick a diverse group of House members to project this unified front from Democrats on the case against Donald Trump. You're seeing that in her choices again. The person who will lead this time, so this is the person who will take the place of Adam Schiff, is Congressman Jamie Raskin. He's the Democrat from Maryland. He's really been responsible for crafting this impeachment's articles. He also was the sponsor of the the resolution yesterday that they voted on to try to get Pence to use the 25th Amendment, and that went ahead, but Pence has said he's not going to go that route. But Jamie Raskin, he's a constitutional lawyer. He's one of the sharpest minds when it comes to the law and impeachment, so they are using him as the lead impeachment manager if a Senate trial commences on that side of Congress. You also have Ted Lieu. He also is on Judiciary Committee. He's a part of that. David Cicilline, he's a congressman of Rhode Island. He also has been a part of the efforts of impeachment right after last Wednesday. So you have all these people who are working very early on this impeachment effort, and who are also very loud voices back in the last impeachment when they were in discussions in those hearings and talking about why the president should be impeached. And I would assume if we do see a trial and they get to make these arguments, you might hear some of the same refrains. I was thinking back to when we covered the last impeachment and the words that Adam Schiff left us with in his closing arguments. He actually tweeted them last week. It was before Wednesday, but last week in light of the Georgia phone call that Trump made with the Secretary of State in Georgia. Adam Schiff reminded us all that he said that this would happen again, that the president does not have decency and does not have national security in mind. So those are words that you will likely hear again if we do see a Senate trial.
James Hohmann, our colleagues Megan Flynn and Aaron Cox had a really poignant piece profiling Jamie Raskin, the congressman, as Rhonda explained to us, is taking the lead as an impeachment manager who suffered the death of his son. and also had to take shelter last week with some of with his other children in the Capitol because they were there at the time when he wanted to show them this demonstration of democracy.
Yeah, and it was supposed to be a healing moment for the family to, the son was a student at Harvard Law School and had been home for the pandemic, and Jamie was so proud of him and talked about him all the time and talked about his professors, Congressman Raskin is a law professor himself in Maryland, I guess at American University before. He was also in the Maryland legislature before he got elected to Congress. And so it just gutted him, his only son, losing him on New Year's Eve, the worst end to 2020. And then to have the first, 11 days of 2021 be just so gutting and stressful, there was a photo that the Wire moved overnight of Liz Cheney talking to Jamie Raskin late last night after the House passed the resolution calling on Mike Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment, and you could see kind of the facial expressions on both of them, and it really was a very human moment that was just moving to see the picture. I covered Liz Cheney's 2014 campaign for Senate in Wyoming very closely, and she had to drop out because of an issue with her daughter, and so I think that they were just connecting as parents more than partisans. So all of that just adds to the emotional weight that Jamie is carrying with him today.
Yeah, and he had to take cover with his daughter and son-in-law. I'm reading from our colleagues' reporting, and you did hear yesterday, Rhonda, just so much sympathy. You've heard it all throughout the last week, 2 weeks for Congressman Raskin. But you do wonder if there's a window there for, as James is saying, the humanity of members of Congress to find, common ground over their lives, the experiences they suffered last week. When we hear Republicans talk of unity, I mean, that's true unity. When people can bond and reflect and share each other's grief and heartache at a time like this, Rhonda.
That's right. I think you are hearing about things that are happening behind the scenes where members are trying to be more comforting toward each other. Even in that Rules Committee meeting yesterday, and we played that clip earlier, but after Representative Perlmutter sort of explodes with a little bit of emotion toward Jim Jordan, he tells Jim Jordan that, we've been working a long time and we need to work together more than ever. And it did seem that Jim Jordan did dial back right then and said, I understand, I know. But while they may be having these moments, briefly, is that going to be seen on the floor? Will it be seen today? Will there be that idea of let's understand each other? Will that influence any sort of legislative agendas after we get through this? Next in the next few weeks, when after Vice President Biden comes as president. So I think these moments are rare when we see members across the aisle sort of reach out to each other, but I think this event last week certainly caused that, and naturally caused it because it was a very human situation where it did not matter what party you were involved in. You were involved in a threat last Wednesday.
Let's bring in Ashley Parker, White House correspondent, into the conversation, joining us by phone. Ashley, what do we know about what the president's doing today?
Well, that is a key reporting target for us. But one thing we are, puzzling about is that when the president was impeached just about a year ago, there was a real effort we saw in the White House, a lobbying effort, a public relations effort to prevent the impeachment, to sway the vote, to try to make sure that it was purely partisan and that no Republicans jumped on board. And that is not happening now. That's one of the most interesting and biggest differences, in part because the president cares less. He's much more focused on how he's emerged as a pariah, losing his megaphone of Twitter and other social media, the PGA pulling out of his Bedminster golf course, banks not lending to him, Mayor Bill de Blasio this morning announcing he's sort of ending the city's financial contracts with the Trump organization. It's hard to believe, but in certain ways, impeachment is not Donald Trump's biggest problem.
You know, it is remarkable, actually, because usually we really do have a good readout in the sense of what the president has on the agenda. And instead, we're just getting this, standard, what's now become a standard line of the president will work from early in the morning until late in the evening. He will make many calls and have many meetings. And that is, we're sort of used to it now, but it is remarkable on a day when he will be impeached by the House of Representatives. He's in the last week of his term in office, and the nation is sort of still reeling from the crisis of last week.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the dynamic is different, and in certain ways, it's hard to know why. I was talking to one senior administration. I was saying, last impeachment, as I just mentioned, there was this whole effort. Why isn't there this effort this time? And first of all, the political dynamic is different. Last impeachment, the president was embarking on a re-election that he needed and wanted to win. This impeachment, he's going to be leaving office in exactly a week, I believe, right? So that's one key difference. And then also, he's lost his Twitter megaphone, and it's hard to really know and sort of existentially say, well, what if this had happened 2 years ago? But it seems to be, and it's hard to prove causation, that Trump not being able to tweet has given, and frankly him not about to lose his presidency, has given some of these members, Republican members, a level of courage that they didn't exhibit before. And so before, you would maybe have one member, like a Mitt Romney, stand up against Donald Trump, and then Trump would tweet something horrible, and the president's children would go after Romney, and the MAGA Nation mob would go after Romney, and it sort of felt like any other lawmaker who was privately telling you they didn't like what the president was doing, or maybe that Ukraine call wasn't so perfect, looks at Romney and says, well, I'm not going to step into this, right? And now he's lost that megaphone. He's about to lose the power of the presidency, and everything simply seems to be falling away.
There was really an echo, Ashley, in the president's comments yesterday about his words. As he defended his words and talked about how they had sort of been analyzed and reviewed and they were appropriate. It sounded so much like his defense on the Ukraine call, right? Perfect call. It's like there's an interesting echo there of not allowing for, and in fact, frankly, lying about the perception of what he said.
Yeah, he said his remarks were reviewed. It's unclear what he's referring to.
Right. Does he mean like by his lawyers? Does he mean by Congress? Well,
the irony is not even. We know how it's played in the media. We know how it's played in Congress, but there hasn't even been a single one of his loyalists, his last people skeletal crew standing, who has been willing to go out and say what Trump is claiming, that, hey, I watched that video, and you know what? I defend his handling of the insurrection on the Capitol Wednesday. There's not a single person willing to say it. The idea that Donald Trump would lie is pretty standard by now, but this is one of these lies where it doesn't even feel like there's the kernel of truth that he needs to help him kind of spin this into credibility.
So Ashley, what are you watching for today? Are you, as we listen for just how Democrats make their case for impeachment on the House floor and how Republicans respond, right? How many ultimately will jump on board, how Republicans will defend President Trump. What are you going to be keyed into?
The two most fascinating things for me, of course, are watching what Republicans do and how this already feels like it's shaping up to be different than the previous impeachment. Not just what Republicans in the House are doing, how many are going to jump ship, but what Republicans in the Senate are saying, because that's where the conviction in certain ways would have more weight, and that Trump then would not be able to run for the presidency again or hold that office again. And of course, I'm going to be watching the president. We know his scheduled claims, the boilerplate, many calls and many meetings, but what is he actually doing? Does he come out and make a last-minute statement in the briefing room? It feels like he's now turning on even his final remaining loyalists. The rupture with Mike Pence is the clearest example, but who does he lash out at? Does he take this in stride? The answer is probably not, but that's what I'm going to be looking for.
Ashley, can we talk about the role of the First Lady and sort of how she's chosen to not speak and then ultimately weigh in on the crisis in the Capitol last week?
Yeah, I think early on in the administration, there was a perception of the First Lady as one of these, as everyone likes to say, these moderating influences, these guardrails, a good influence on her husband, the president. And I think what we've learned over the, through reporting over the course of 4 years is she's actually very Trumpy in a different way. She's not as vocal, but she, just like he does, she follows all of her press incredibly closely. She follows the gossip and the attacks on her on television and social media very closely. And she often has sort of to put it mildly, a tone-deaf response. And that's what we saw with that statement. Her silence in not speaking out on Wednesday was notable and noted. And then when she did finally speak out, someone put it to me, it read like a statement where you're missing sort of like your spokesperson and your chief of staff, which she is, because that person who filled those roles resigned on Wednesday. And part of the statement was basically saying, oh, poor me, was addressing the criticism of her, which is just stunning that anyone, let alone a First Lady, could look at what happened at the Capitol, could look at what her husband encouraged, and instead of simply expressing horror and sympathy and empathy for not just the families, but for the nation, could dare to say, and what about that bad press I've been getting on this? I mean, it's very Trumpy in a certain way, and certainly not the traditional behavior we expect from a First Lady.
I mean, it was astounding, and actually, people may have missed it just because there's been so much going on this past week, but she did make it about herself, and she ultimately talked about, false accusations, she said, unwanted personal attacks about herself rather than the healing moment for the nation. Ashley, so 1 week left. Can you give us any sense of the concern or lack thereof in the White House of the Senate actually convicting the president, right? We are getting some signals that Mitch McConnell is open and amenable perhaps to impeachment, which is shocking and very revealing of his relationship with President Trump. I mean, lately, McConnell's been talking more to Joe Biden than he has to Donald Trump. Is there a concern or fear in the White House that the Senate, could actually convict the president?
I mean, again, they're generally, as of now at least, less concerned about impeachment in sort of the sense I've heard echoed of like, well, what does even matter at this point, right? But the part that I think we'll be watching for and trying to figure out is what would it mean for Donald Trump's political future if he was convicted by the Senate and then got the vote where he couldn't run for office again. Donald Trump can still show up in a city and primary the heck out of Republicans who crossed him and maybe really sink them in 2022. But it's a lot harder to freeze the party and claim yourself still the acting head of the Republican Party if you can't run and you can't even threaten to run for the presidency again in 2024. So that feels like the biggest ramification in the area in which they would be most worried.
All right, Ashley Parker, White House reporter. Thank you so much for your time, Ashley. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, before the attack on the Capitol, President Trump spoke at what was billed as a Save America rally. The president falsely claimed that the 2020 election was stolen from him and said, "We will never concede." And the president pledged to fight alongside the crowd. Let's watch.
We're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give, the Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything. Not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help, We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country.
Now, it's important to note that the president did not join the mob like he said he would. He remained in the White House and watched the attack on the Capitol on live television. It was not until after, really hours after, the mob had breached the Capitol that we finally heard from President Trump, and he once again falsely claimed that it was an election fraud, despite all the facts and despite resolution from states, the courts, and Congress. Let's watch that.
There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel.
That's President Trump last week, hours after the insurrection happened at the Capitol, after lawmakers were hiding to survive the mob. James Homan, a week later, it is still shocking to hear the president say, "We love you, you're very special," a message directed at people who were attacking the United States Capitol.
At that moment.
At that very moment. Right.
And that was the third take. And aides sort of settled for it. They urged him not to say that. They urged him to just call for people to go home and for peace. He dragged his feet. He wanted to go and go on his own grievance, make it about himself. At the same time, Ivanka Trump was referring to the mob as American patriots. Even Donald Trump Jr., who was flying from that rally on the ellipse back to New York, tweeted before his father weighed in, look, this isn't who we are, stop with the violence, disperse. But the president himself wouldn't do that for hours more. And then the next day he went farther and issued a second video statement saying there would be a peaceful, orderly transition of power. But then when he was watching coverage of it, he lashed out and yelled at aides who had encouraged him to record that video, telling them that they had made him look weak and that he wishes he hadn't said he was going to hand off power peacefully and all that. So that's one of the reasons that a lot of Republicans are so uneasy with him, because he really has not showed any contrition. And I think Republicans were looking for a little contrition so that they could sort of hang their hat on that. You saw Roy Blunt, the Republican chairman of the Senate Rules Committee, saying on the Sunday shows, Trump touched the hot stove last Wednesday. He's learned his lesson. He's not going to touch the hot stove again. And it's very difficult to watch, talk to White House people about what's really going on, but to watch the video of his speech in Texas yesterday and think that Trump has any remorse at all for what happened last week or for his role in it.
Rhonda Colvin, let's go to the text of the article. This is the one article of impeachment. It's 4 pages long. And as we comb through it, you see the authors of this, the Democratic authors of this, make their case for why President Trump should be impeached. And obviously, they're specifically focusing on the attack on the Capitol. So let's talk about what they're actually accusing him of and sort of his role in it.
Well, they're simply accusing him of the fact that his statements led to that insurrection, that the tape you just played, I assume when we get to a Senate trial, if it goes there, that tape is going to be played as a part of the evidence, that they are building a case that there is a direct correlation between the president's remarks saying, go down to the Capitol, he's making a command, and he's also saying he supports the attempt to go to the Capitol, and because he said, I'll be with you, we're with you. Although we know he did not go. This impeachment, this is one of the reasons why this impeachment is far different from the last. The last, to many Americans, probably had a lot of different moving parts. It was abuse of power, it was obstruction of justice. There were multiple ways that Ukraine call led to those charges. And the House impeachment managers had so many, if you remember, so many PowerPoint presentations to support their argument. But this is a very brief resolution, honestly. You mentioned it's just a few pages, and it's very direct. And I think that that also goes to the attempt the Democrats are trying to make in saying that this is a very easy to understand effort. This is something that we don't have to sell hard to the American people. We all saw the clip. We all saw him speak to a crowd that immediately went toward the Capitol. I'd also like to point out, too, that there were other people there who were making speeches, too. Mo Brooks, the Republican congressman from Alabama, he made some inflammatory comments as well, and some of his colleagues have asked in the House that he be censured for his role in this as well. So there are some other voices that are sort of like supplementary to what the president did in that speech. But really, this resolution is very quick and to the point, and I think most Americans can understand it.
And James Hohmann, it also brings up President Trump's attempts to interfere with the Georgia election results.
Which was based on Washington Post reporting. Our colleague Amy Gardner obtained that phone call. It feels like an eternity ago, but it was just the Sunday before last, of Trump calling Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, and pressuring him to retabulate or recalculate to find 11,000 votes, one more than he was losing to Biden by. We subsequently learned via Amy's reporting that Trump also called a junior election fraud investigator in the Georgia Secretary of State's office who was looking into fraud to call him and tell him he'd be a national hero if he could find some fraud. Trump fired or forced to resign the U.S. attorney for the top federal prosecutor for Atlanta. And instead of following the rules and having a career federal prosecutor in that office replace him, his own appointee, Trump went and took the U.S. attorney from Savannah and put him in charge of Atlanta. That guy brought two people who have background in trying to find election fraud, especially in the African American community, not successfully, but that's been their focus. And so Trump has literally been, and this article makes that case. He's been abusing his power in order to try and overturn the results of a free and fair election using, the bully pulpit of the presidency. So that's definitely part of it. And you have to kind of look at the whole context of everything that's happened since November. As you've noted, Libby, so many times, as we've been talking and everything has played out, Trump said before the election, he said during that first debate that was moderated by Chris Wallace that he wasn't going to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. He telegraphed for months that if he lost, he would claim there was fraud. And that's sure enough exactly what he did. The night after the election, the early morning after the election, he came out and started doing all of this. And I actually was overnight watching that video from Gabriel Sterling, who's one of the top elections officials in the Georgia Secretary of State's office. He said several weeks ago, he went out and had a news conference and he said, look, someone's going to get killed if the president doesn't cut this out. If the president keeps saying that the election was stolen from him and that people need to go fight, people are going to die. And so he needs to cut it out. And it was chilling to watch that video because it really does just undercut the idea that, that no one could have seen this coming. That no one thought that the dangerous rhetoric from the president would have violent and deadly consequences.
So, James, as we heard from Ashley, just a few moments ago, Ashley Parker, White House colleague, there's less concern right now, it sounds like, in the shrinking Trump world at the White House about just how this sort of plays out. I'd like to get your reflections on that. I mean, how much of a threat does this process really hold for both President Trump as well as the former President Donald Trump as he moves out of office next week?
Quite a lot, potentially. Initially last week, the acting U.S. attorney for D.C., a Trump appointee, during a conference called Decline to Rule Out, bringing charges against the president. Then he kind of walked that back a little bit. But White House counsel Pat Cipollone has reportedly told the president that he faces significant civil liability. ABC News reported yesterday that Cipollone told Trump, think OJ. OJ Simpson was found not guilty of murdering his ex-wife and Nicole Kidman and Ron Goldman. But then Goldman's family sued Simpson in civil court for that and there's some concern among Trump lawyers that people could sue Trump for the same thing, for inciting this, for causing the violence, perhaps the families of some of the officers who were injured. Nicole Brown Simpson.
Yeah. So, James, it's interesting because it does seem like the advisors to President Trump have to talk in those sort of very sort of cinematic or simplistic terms, right? Like, think O.J. Simpson resonate in one's mind in sort of a very simplistic but significant way. The president is losing advisors, though, right? He's losing people that he can count on right now to help course correct him. Ashley's observation was so astute about how Melania Trump's statement that came out this week that was so tone deaf in its reference to her own self rather than just the horror that Americans have gone through this past week read like someone who'd lost the people who help her craft statements, right? And the president's also losing people in his immediate inner circle right now.
Yeah, and in fact, that Melania statement from the First Lady, more than half of it was copied verbatim, literally word for word, copy and pasted from her Republican convention speech in August. They just, she took the template of it and dropped some new language in, and that is a reflection that she doesn't have, her speechwriter is gone. A lot of people, even those who are still in the White House, are avoiding Trump. They're trying not to talk to him or interact with him or sit with him, we're told, or at least that's what they claim. A lot of the president's, two of the president's former chiefs of staff have said that they would vote to invoke the 25th Amendment if they were still in the cabinet. Mick Mulvaney resigned his post as the U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland. Chris Christie has turned on the president publicly. And so you have a lot of that. But then inside you do have this bunker mentality. And the only way to get through to Trump is to, highlight his own liability and vulnerability. And that's one of the reasons that the president is talking and continuing to think about a self-pardon, because he is worried about his liability on the federal level. He obviously has some state liability in addition to that as well.
Okay, Rhonda Colvin, if people are just tuning in, remind us what we're waiting for and what we're watching right now.
We are still on the vote that started a while ago on the rules and the process that will be happening when they get to the articles of impeachment vote. So this is sort of the preamble and the step that happens to bring a piece of legislation to the floor. One of the reasons it is a little slower than usual, although the process is often slow, is because of COVID, and that the House floor has rules about how many people can be on the floor at a time, and many members have been voting by proxy, which is a way for them not to be present but allow another representative to vote for them. So that takes a while to happen when you have more than 400 members on the House, and then also it has to be tabulated by the clerks you see up there too. So it's a long process, and that's what we're still waiting for, and then we will move on to debate, which will begin the process of impeaching the president in the House.
Let's bring in our White House Bureau Chief, Philip Rucker, joining us now. Phil, give us some insight into the mind of President Trump right now.
Well, Libby, it's good to be with you on this historic day. The president, according to our reporting, is angry, isolated. He's very much alone. The White House is practically a ghost town these days. Very few aides that are left, and many of those who are left are not on good terms with the president. It's been striking the last few days that not a single member of the administration has publicly defended how the president handled himself on January 6th, inciting that mob to storm the Capitol. And that speaks volumes, I think, about the state of this administration. I traveled with the president yesterday down to Texas aboard Air Force One for a visit to a piece of newly constructed border wall. And the president was defiant and unapologetic, and he claimed that his speech on the ellipse last Wednesday, right before that mob riot began, was totally appropriate. Those are the president's words. He said that it was being praised and reviewed by people in the media as totally appropriate. We know that is not true. It's been roundly condemned, including by many of his Republican allies. But it speaks to the fact that the president remains in denial about his own complicity and his personal responsibility in what happened at the Capitol. I can also tell you, based on reporting just in the last hour, that the president, while he's focused on impeachment today, is actually more concerned with some of the other things happening around him. He is fast becoming a pariah. We've seen the PGA withdraw its golf tournament that was scheduled to be held at his golf course in Bedminster. We've seen Deutsche Bank, one of the world's leading banks that had been dealing with Trump over the years, say it would refuse to loan money to Trump. We just saw in the last couple of hours the city of New York announcing that they would cancel all their contracts with the Trump Organization. So Trump's brand is taking a huge beating here. He's losing political support, but he's also losing financial support and the possibilities for future earnings when he leaves office. And that in particular has him furious right now.
Well, as Phil mentioned, President Trump spoke yesterday as he was leaving the White House, and he showed no remorse about his words inciting the mob that killed a police officer and threatened his vice president and members of Congress. Let's listen.
So if you read my speech, and many people have done it, and I've seen it both in the papers and in the media, on television, it's been analyzed, and people thought that what I said was totally appropriate. And if you look at what other people have said, politicians at a high level, about the riots during the summer, the horrible riots in Portland and Seattle and various other places, that was a real problem, what they said. But they've analyzed my speech and my words and my final paragraph, my final sentence, and everybody to the T thought it was totally appropriate.
Phil Rucker, it's always fascinating to hear that sort of vague they, the people they've analyzed, no definite noun being used on who he's talking about.
Yeah, Libby, the reality is there is really no they. We've not seen anybody in the media come to the president's defense to say that his speech was totally appropriate. We've certainly seen a lot of Republican allies say they don't think he should be removed from office, say they don't think impeachment is a good idea. But even his most loyal defenders and allies have still criticized his remarks in that speech and feel like his rhetoric was responsible, at least in part, for the horror that unfolded at the Capitol.
Phil, my perception is that the heat has gone up, right? Especially among Democrats, but also Republicans, some Republicans as well, in the week since the attack on the Capitol, right? Instead of sort of temperatures cooling and people feeling calmer about it, the more members of Congress are briefed and the more they learn from law enforcement about just how dangerous and how terrified some of their colleagues were last week, the angrier people have gotten.
I think that's right. And what we've learned through disclosures from law enforcement and through reporting by many news organizations, including the Washington Post in the last week, is that this could have been so much worse. It's really a miracle that there weren't more lives lost. There could have been a bloody massacre of lawmakers taken hostage and or killed. The chants of hang Mike Pence that rang through the Capitol. I mean, this was a horrific event. And as lawmakers learn more about it, and they understand more how these people were organized and were ready to do great harm, and importantly, were motivated by the president's lie about the election. They were motivated because they believed the president when he said that the election was rigged and had been stolen from him.
Philip Rucker, we're going to cut you off just to go to the House floor. Thank you.
The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Phil, do we still have you? Oh, I think we just might have lost Phil Rucker. James, I want to bring this to you as we continue to watch what happens on the House floor here, James. I'm just keeping track here on my side camera to make sure we don't miss anything important. There was a good degree of whataboutism. We heard this in Trump's statement. We heard President Trump referring to events